The desert was quiet when the mask first tasted air again. A hush hung over the royal cemetery of Ur, broken only by the rhythmic scrape of brushes against ancient dust. For days, the archaeologists had been working under a relentless sun, uncovering small pieces of jewelry, fragments of pottery, and bones gone soft with age. Nothing unusual, nothing unexpected. Then, just after noon, a glint surfaced beneath a thin crust of earth. First, it looked like a coin, but as the layers fell away, the shape grew, widened, curved. The team paused. Someone whispered, "Gold." Not a coin, not a trinket, something far larger. Something shaped like a human face. The pit around them seemed to deepen as time stretched, as though the desert itself held its breath. Tools slowed. Movements became delicate. A block of earth was cut out and lifted whole, wrapped like a newborn. Only when it rested safely in the conservation tent did the final brushing begin. And then, the sands of Mesopotamia released a secret they had guarded for over 4 millennia. A golden face emerged. A face so still, so deliberate, it felt alive. Its eyes slanted slightly, as though studying the living who now stared back. The lips curved just enough to suggest authority but remained closed, withholding whatever truth it knew. The craftsmanship was impossibly refined for its time. Hammered gold sheets seamlessly contoured to replicate the bone structure of a real man. Lapis lazuli traced the eyebrows in an unbroken blue arc, a symbol of divinity in a world long vanished. It was beautiful, breathtaking, and deeply unsettling. Faces carved in stone weather away. Names on clay tablets crumble. But this mask had preserved the exact contours of a forgotten king's final moment. It was as if he had been waiting silently, through the rise and fall of empires, for someone to meet his gaze again. But the real mystery began when they looked for his identity. Nearby objects offered clues at first. Gold daggers, ornate lyres, silver cups. Luxuries reserved only for royalty. The burial chamber was richly appointed, almost theatrical in its grandeur. Yet there was something odd. Other kings of Ur had their names adorned everywhere. Inscribed on statues, etched into seals, stamped onto bricks. A Sumerian ruler lived forever through his name. That was the point. To erase a name was to erase a life. But around this mask, nothing. No name, no inscription, no seal, no hint of lineage. It was as if someone had purposely wiped every trace of him away. The excavators were confused at first. They had found the burial chamber of Lady Pwabi years earlier. She had a name, clear identity, a legacy. But this king, though buried with treasures even more extravagant, had been stripped of the single thing that mattered most in Sumerian belief: remembrance. Why bury a king in gold, only to erase him from history? Thinkers across disciplines began to circle this question. Archaeologists, historians, epigraphers, they all came looking for answers. Theories multiplied. Some said he might have been a usurper, a ruler who seized power briefly before being violently overthrown. Others suggested he might have been a heretic, someone who challenged religious authority in a city governed by priests. And some believed he was too dangerous to remember, his legacy intentionally destroyed so his influence would die with him. But the mask itself silently contradicted all of them. A tyrant would not be honored with such artistry. A heretic would not be buried with royal rites. And a political enemy would not be laid to rest among treasures imported from lands thousands of miles away. So what was he? The archaeologists searched deeper. They dug through soil riddled with broken bones and ceremonial objects. They found traces of ancient music, lyres and harps crushed beneath collapsing earth. They found remnants of chariots, spears, and helmets, all seemingly arranged as if for a grand procession into the afterlife. They found bodies too, dozens. Men and women sprawled in careful formations, each positioned as though frozen in a moment of ritual service. But the deeper forensic studies later revealed something darker. Some had been drugged before death. Others had not. Some lay as though peacefully asleep. Others showed signs of struggle. Behind the gold and beauty lay a grim secret, a burial ritual not fully voluntary. This revelation complicated everything. If the mask's owner was involved in such rituals, what kind of king had he been? A feared figure demanding obedience even in death? Or a ruler whose followers willingly or unwillingly followed him into eternity? The golden face offered no answers. It only stared forward, serene, impenetrable. Yet there was something else. Something subtle, almost hidden. When examined under modern tools, a faint mark appeared near the jawline. A stress line where the mask had been bent, forcibly or violently. It didn't match natural burial decay. It looked like pressure, as if someone had once torn the mask off a face. Had the king been stripped of his identity during his final moments? Had the mask been removed after death, perhaps during a coup or ritual cleansing, only to be placed back centuries later by someone attempting to restore his honor? Or was it simply damage from the collapse of the tomb over time? In history, small fractures can change entire stories. Night after night in the desert camp, scholars sat beneath lanterns discussing possibilities. The mask lay in a nearby tent, resting on linen sheets. And every time someone pulled back the cover, they felt the same sensation, like they were interrupting someone. Like the king beneath that gold was waiting for his story to be told correctly. There was no denying it. The expression on the mask, calm yet unyielding, seemed almost aware, and it became clear why this object sent waves of unease across the archaeological world. This was not simply a burial artifact. It was a challenge, a silent question stretching across thousands of years. Why did you forget me? Civilizations fall. Stories disappear. But kings do not vanish without reason. Someone erased him. Someone wanted his name gone forever. And someone buried him under a monument of wealth to hide the truth or honor it in secret. The golden mask of Uar had returned. And with it, an ancient reckoning. Long before the mask was lifted from the desert floor, long before modern eyes glimpsed its golden surface, there was a city that rose out of mud, reed, and myth. Uar did not begin as the mighty metropolis the world remembers. It began as a cluster of huts along a slow, winding branch of the Euphrates, a place where fishermen cast nets into shallow waters and families lived in dwellings no taller than a man's shoulder. Nothing about it suggested destiny. Nothing hinted that this quiet settlement would one day hold the bones of kings or command the attention of empires. And yet, something stirred beneath its clay foundations, an ambition shaped by the needs of survival. The rivers, at times generous, at times cruel, forced the earliest inhabitants to learn the rhythms of nature, to build canals, store grains, tame floods. With each struggle came organization. With organization came authority. And with authority came the idea of kingship, a concept that emerged not from luxury, but from the terror of an unpredictable world. As centuries passed, the village grew bold. Mud brick replaced reed. Walls rose. Traders arrived from far-off lands, bringing obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and legends from cities whose names are now lost. Someone carved the first shrine. Another shaped the first seal. And soon, Uar stepped into history not as a village, but as a city-state, one of the first the world had ever seen. People spoke of it almost with reverence. Not because of its size, but because of its spirit. Uar felt like a place walking toward destiny. Its streets were narrow but alive, its markets loud with barter and gossip, its workshops glowing with bronze furnaces. The smell of baked bread mixed with the tang of smelted metal. You could hear the clattering of donkey carts even at night. Life pulsed through the city like blood through a newborn kingdom's veins. But the true heart of Uar did not lie on the ground. Towered above everything, the ziggurat. Constructed with millions of clay bricks, its silhouette dominated the horizon. A stairway for mortals to reach the realm of the gods. Dedicated to Nana, the moon god, it was more than a temple. It was a declaration that Uar was chosen, blessed, watched. Every brick whispered devotion. Priests climbed its steps to read the sky, to record omens, to interpret celestial movements. The city's fate was reflected in the phases of the moon, and the moon in turn guided its rulers. To belong to Uar was to belong to a world where heaven and earth blurred. And yet, beneath all of this divine grandeur, There was a more human story, one of competition, envy, and ambition. Sumer was not a peaceful land. It was a mosaic of city-states, each with its own ruler, its own god, its own dream of supremacy. Lagash, Kish, Amma, Uruk, each watched the others with suspicion. Water rights sparked wars. Trade routes sparked alliances. Entire dynasties rose and crumbled like sand dunes. Through all of this, Uar endured. His people learned diplomacy, warfare, and trade with equal skill. They recorded their victories in cuneiform tablets, carved their genealogies into stone, and celebrated their gods with festivals that lasted days. At night, the glow of countless oil lamps reflected off the river, making the city look like it floated on a mirror of stars. It was during this ascent from settlement to sacred city that the masked king must have lived. His world was not tranquil. It was charged with spiritual purpose and political danger. The rulers of Uar were not just kings. They were mediators between humans and divine forces. A bad harvest could be blamed on them. A failed war could stain their bloodline. Their success or failure shaped the destiny of thousands. To understand this king, the one whose face now stares out from gold, we must understand the world that shaped him. Imagine walking through Uar around the time of his reign. The streets are crowded, but you move with purpose. Children chase each other past stalls selling dates and barley. Merchants argue over the weight of silver. Soldiers in copper helmets inspect passing caravans. The sun glints off bronze tools, clay pots, and the glossy fur of animals brought from distant lands. Above you, banners flutter, symbols of the moon, symbols of power. Near the river, boatmen unload cargo that has traveled across hundreds of miles. In the distance, construction crews haul bricks to repair a temple wall damaged by last season's storms. It is clear that this is not a world of stagnation. It is a world racing forward, inventing, organizing, transforming. Uar was alive. Its people practiced mathematics for accounting, astronomy for agriculture, law for order. They created myths not because they were ignorant, but because they were searching for meaning in a world of sudden floods and unpredictable skies. They honored rulers not only because of fear, but because they truly believed kings could bridge the gap between human frailty and divine will. In such a world, a king's rise could be meteoric, but so could his fall. Power in Sumer was delicate. A king who lost favor with priests could be replaced. A king who failed in war could be assassinated. A king who challenged the traditions of the ziggurat could be damned not only in life, but in memory. This is the world into which the masked king stepped. A world where glory and oblivion lived side by side, separated only by the shifting loyalties of gods and men. Understanding Uar means understanding the stakes of kingship in its most ancient form. It means understanding why a man might be honored in death with gold, yet stripped of his name for eternity. It means recognizing that behind the shimmering facade of early civilization, behind the beauty of jewelry, the symmetry of temples, the innovation of writing, there was a constant struggle for survival, order, and remembrance. Every king of Uar walked a tightrope. One miscalculation, one betrayal, one divine omen interpreted incorrectly, and the city's support could vanish overnight. And history, controlled by scribes loyal to victors, would erase the loser as though he never lived. The Golden Mask belongs to one such story, one that unfolded in a city that emerged from mud, rose to greatness, and built monuments meant to last forever. Yet even in a city obsessed with memory, one ruler's name disappeared. The city he helped shape carried on. The temples remained. The people adapted. The mask survived. Only the man behind it slipped into darkness. And to uncover him, we must walk deeper into Uar, into its tombs, its rituals, its power struggles, and the secrets it meant to hide. The wind was gentle the morning Sir Leonard Woolley stood at the edge of what he believed might be the greatest archaeological find in Mesopotamia. The sand beneath his boots was fine, almost powdery, drifting in slow swirls as though the desert itself were restless. For weeks, his team had been following faint anomalies, subtle depressions in the earth, shards of pottery too finely made to be ordinary, traces of ancient pigments clinging to forgotten soil layers. Nothing conclusive, nothing certain, just hints. But Wooly's instincts told him they were close. It was 1926. The world was still fascinated by the recent discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, and every archaeologist dreamed of another untouched burial waiting beneath the sands. Yet Wooly was not chasing gold. He was chasing a story, one buried deeper than treasure, older than empires. In his mind, Ur was not just another Sumerian ruin. It was the cradle of kingship, the birthplace of myth, the city that had taught the world what civilization could become. That morning, a workman's shout broke the silence. Wooly turned sharply, his heart quickening. He hurried down the slope into a partially excavated trench where two laborers knelt, brushing frantically at something dark in the soil. At first glance, it looked like charcoal. Then the texture came through, brittle but structured. Bone. Human bone. It was the first skeleton they found in what would eventually be called the Royal Cemetery. Not remarkable in itself, burials were common near ancient cities, but something about its position felt intentional. The body lay on its back, arms arranged neatly at its sides, head aligned perfectly with the rising sun. No signs of hasty burial. No signs of violence. Whoever this person was, someone had taken care. Wooly ordered the trench widened. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. More bodies. More arrangements. More care. Paths carved in the earth revealed lines of tombs. Some small, some massive, some collapsed into themselves. Dozens became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. In time, the true scale of the sight forced Wooly to pause. He stood atop a wooden platform one evening at sunset and looked down at the cemetery in awe. The landscape had transformed into a maze of chambers. Rectangular graves, brick-lined sarcophagi, vaulted burial pits. It was no ordinary necropolis. It was a city of the dead beneath the city of the living. But the real surprise came when they reached the deeper layers. As they descended through centuries of earth, the graves became more elaborate. Jewelry began to appear, simple at first, then more ornate. Shell inlays, agate beads, gold rings. Sumer's artistry unfolded backward through time like the chapters of a book read in reverse. The deeper they went, the more refined the craftsmanship became, until the team began encountering objects so exquisite they seemed almost impossible. Bronze helmets with delicate engraving. Silver lyres carved with bull-headed motifs. Daggers with handles wound in electrum. Chariots adorned with lapis and carnelian. The cemetery was not merely a burial ground, it was a museum of the early human imagination. Then, in one chamber, Wooly noticed something unusual. A row of skulls lay near the entrance, each positioned with almost ritualistic symmetry. Nearby, clay cups lay scattered. Tests would later reveal traces of ancient intoxicants. The theory was chilling even then. Attendants or servants had been sacrificed to accompany their ruler into the afterlife. Wooly, who understood Sumerian culture better than most men alive at the time, felt the weight of the discovery. These were not accidental deaths. This was ceremony. This was power manifested through ritual. This was a glimpse into a world where kings commanded loyalty beyond life itself. But the strangest chamber was yet to come. It began with the discovery of a slope, an angled ramp descending into what seemed to be a deliberately dug pit. At the bottom lay a chamber so vast it dwarfed the others. Walls of mud brick rose around a central platform, and scattered across the floor were the remains of dozens of individuals. Lyres lay fallen beside musicians whose fingers still curled around broken strings. Soldiers lay with their helmets still in place. Servants clutched vessels of gold, as if waiting for a command that never came. This was not a burial. This was a tableau, frozen, silent, perfectly preserved and deeply unsettling. Wooly walked among them with almost reverent steps. He described the scene later in his journal. They lay as though gently asleep, a concert of death arranged with impossible grace. Yet even in his awe, he could not ignore the darker truth. Many of these people had not died voluntarily. Modern forensics would confirm that years after, some skulls bore blunt trauma. Others showed no trauma at all, suggesting poison or some other means of induced sleep. And always, there were objects of gold, crowns, necklaces, bowls, staffs, glittering against the dust in eerie defiance of time. The deeper Wooly dug, the more it felt as though UR had buried its secrets beneath layers of wealth and ceremony, hoping that the splendor would distract from something darker lurking beneath. And then came the chamber that changed everything. The entrance was narrow, almost hidden, sealed with mud brick that had hardened into something like stone. It took hours to clear, hours of delicate work to avoid collapse. When the final brick was removed, a rush of stale air escaped, a breath from a forgotten age. Lanterns were brought inside, their light trembling across the freshly exposed walls. The chamber was small but dense with objects. Gold filigree, polished beads, weapons of extraordinary craftsmanship. Everything smelled of antiquity and damp earth. But Wooly sensed immediately that the room was incomplete. Something was missing. An absence hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. They found the body soon after, at the far end of the chamber, partially hidden beneath a crumbled section of the ceiling. The bones were arranged carefully, deliberately, and beside the skull lay a fragment of gold so pure it shone even under dirt. The team worked in silence as more pieces emerged, curved, hammered, shaped. A cheek, a brow, a jawline, the remnants of something once whole. A mask, a royal mask, the one they would later restore fully to reveal a face no one recognized. Wooly sensed the importance immediately. He understood history, and he knew the power of symbols. A golden funerary mask was a rare honor. It was the immortality of kings. Yet the tomb bore no name, no inscription, no seal. It was wrong. Everything about it defied Sumerian practice. Kings wanted to be remembered. Kings demanded to be remembered. So why hide this one? Why place him in a royal chamber yet erase every trace of who he had been? Wooly did not have the answer. But he knew one thing. This was not the tomb of a typical ruler. This was the burial of someone extraordinary, either loved too much or hated too completely. The desert, so patient for millennia, had offered up the first clue. And the golden mask of UR now waited for the world to unravel its story. The excavators called them death pits, but the word felt inadequate. A pit suggested chaos, disorder, something crude. What Wooly and his team uncovered beneath the sands of UR was nothing like that. It was choreography. It was ritual. It was something ancient and unsettling, arranged with a precision that haunted anyone who saw it. When the workers first broke into the largest of these pits, the lantern light flickered across something pale, bone. Then something shining, gold. Then another shimmer. And another. As the sand was brushed away, the scene revealed itself like a frozen final act of a play. Dozens of bodies lay arranged in perfect lines. At the front were soldiers, still wearing copper helmets that caught the dim light like dulled mirrors. Spears rested beside them, their tips eaten by centuries. Their posture suggested readiness rather than collapse. Behind them lay women adorned in jewelry. Heavy necklaces, golden combs, elaborate headdresses that once signified status within the palace. Musicians lay beside instruments whose strings had long since rotted away, but whose frames remained intact. Lyres shaped with the heads of bulls and adorned with lapis lazuli. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing here felt like a mass grave. It felt like a procession halted mid-step. Wooly studied the arrangement with growing unease. If these people had been slaughtered in war or swept up by disease, the positioning would have been chaotic. Instead, they lay as though placed carefully by hands that respected them, or feared the consequences of disrespect. But as the dig continued, small cracks appeared in the illusion of peace. For months, Wooly believed these people had willingly given their lives to follow their ruler into the afterlife, a custom recorded in some ancient texts. It seemed noble, tragic, and strangely beautiful. That was the story he wanted to believe, the story he even published in early reports. But archaeology, like history, rarely cooperates with the stories we expect. Decades later, when forensic experts examined the remains, they found injuries inconsistent with peaceful death. Some skulls bore round depressions, blunt force trauma delivered with precision. Others carried no marks at all, suggesting poison or suffocation. Traces of certain chemicals hinted at a narcotic, possibly used to sedate the victims before the final blow. What Woolley thought was a serene procession was, in truth, far more complicated and far more tragic. Imagine the final moments inside that pit thousands of years ago. Torches burning low, priests chanting hymns, the scent of incense thick enough to dull the senses. Servants, attendants, guards, people who had spent their lives inside the palace, now lined up in ritual formation. Some drank from ceremonial cups, believing they were honoring their king. Others likely resisted, fear twisting their final breaths. All of them, however, were arranged afterward with care, their death transformed into spectacle. The deeper Woolley's team dug, the more questions surfaced. Why did this ritual exist at all? Why bury so many with a single ruler? What belief or fear drove a civilization to orchestrate such a spectacle of final loyalty? Some scholars argue it was devotion, the idea that the king needed a court in the afterlife. Others suggest it was coercion disguised as honor. And some, more darkly, propose it was a demonstration of power, a warning to the living about the reach of a king's authority. But the strangest part was not the bodies, it was the graves themselves. Some of the pits were enormous. One burial, later nicknamed the Great Death Pit, held over 70 individuals. And yet, not every royal burial included such sacrifices. Only certain graves bore the signature of this ritual. Only certain rulers were honored or feared enough to be accompanied by such an entourage into death. Which raises the most chilling question of all. What kind of ruler required such a ritual? It is within this question that the masked king's story begins to take shape. In the tomb where the golden mask was found, the surrounding chambers bore similarities to the death pits. Traces of attendants, broken instruments, scattered jewelry. But something about this burial felt different. The pit was smaller, more controlled. The objects were richer, and the bodies far fewer, as if someone wanted the grandeur of ritual without the spectacle of mass sacrifice. Or perhaps, as some scholars now suspect, the king's burial was rushed, interrupted, sabotaged. Among the bones recovered from the surrounding chambers were signs of struggle, positioning inconsistent with the carefully staged arrangements of earlier pits. Some bodies lay twisted, others collapsed as if falling instead of being placed. A few even had arms raised, as though shielding themselves from blows. This burial was not the peaceful scene described in Woolley's early writings. It was chaotic, it was violent, and it hinted at a deeper truth. The death ritual of UR might not always have been voluntary. It may have been weaponized, used by those in power to cleanse the palace during political upheaval. If that is true, then the presence of attendants near the masked king was not honor, it was evidence. Evidence of a struggle, evidence of a collapse, evidence of a death not marked by reverence alone, but by fear, betrayal, or both. Standing above the excavation, Woolley often described the cemetery as hauntingly silent. But the silence was deceptive. The pits whispered. The arrangement of bodies spoke of ceremony. The fractures in bones spoke of violence. And the sheer scale of the graves spoke of a culture obsessed with power, ritual, and the afterlife. Yet nothing was as haunting as the contrast between the richly adorned dead and the single golden mask found in the hidden chamber nearby. The death pits were filled with bodies, but not a single funerary mask except his. Why him? Why only him? Why did this one man deserve a face hammered into immortality while the others were left bare? Unnamed? The answer, scholars believe, lies somewhere between reverence and damnation. A king whose identity was erased yet buried in gold. A ruler honored with ritual sacrifices yet hidden in a sealed chamber. A man who commanded loyalty or fear so deep that dozens died with him, or because of him. The pits around him were not just graves. They were context, a mirror reflecting the world he ruled. Beautiful, terrifying, ceremonial, violent. And somewhere within that mirror, hidden behind gold and silence, lies the truth of the king who history tried to forget. It was not the gold that stunned the researchers. It was the expression. The moment the restored mask was revealed under the white laboratory lights, every person in the room felt it instantly. This was not simply a funerary ornament. This was a portrait. A face crafted with such precision that it may have been taken from life, molded from the likeness of a real man whose eyes once surveyed the city of Ur. The mask was small enough to cradle, yet impossibly commanding. Hammered sheets of gold, thin as breath but strong enough to endure for millennia, had been shaped into a visage both human and otherworldly. The cheeks bore subtle contours that suggested flesh and bone beneath. The lips carried a hint of firmness, a ruler's restraint. The nose, narrow and proud, cast a sharp shadow, giving the mask a sense of presence no artifact from this era should possess. But it was the eyes that unsettled everyone. Their almond shape was elongated just slightly, suggesting alertness, intelligence, suspicion. They were framed by inlaid lapis lazuli eyebrows, deep blue, almost glowing, carved with such smoothness it seemed as though the artist feared making the expression too severe. The blue of the eyebrows contrasted sharply with the warm gold of the face, creating a visual calibration that made the entire mask feel awake. No other artifact from ancient Sumer carried such uncanny realism. No other king had been depicted in this way, and that alone raised a troubling question. Why? Kings of Ur were depicted in statues, yes, but stylized, idealized, symbolic. Their faces were not meant to represent individuality but authority. They were expressions carved for gods, not portraits intended to reflect the features of a man who once breathed. This mask, however, was personal. It showed identity. It showed humanity. It showed someone, and that someone could not be found in any king list, inscription, or artifact known from the era. The more scholars compared the mask to known artistic conventions of early dynastic Sumer, the more anomalies appeared. The gold was purer than typical royal pieces. The inlay technique more advanced. The stylistic choices, particularly the symmetry of the cheekbones and the rise of the brow ridge, suggested influence from outside Ur, perhaps from the north or east, where metalworking traditions differed. Some wondered whether the mask was the product of an artisan trained abroad. Others wondered whether the king himself had foreign ancestry. Some whispered the possibility that he was not a legitimate ruler at all but a usurper. Yet nothing was certain, because no inscription accompanied the mask. No stone tablet declared his name. No cylinder seal bore his likeness. No textile or brick carried even a partial reference to his reign. In Sumer, this was impossible. Kings immortalized themselves in every medium available. They built temples. They recorded laws. They stamped their names into bricks by the thousands. Their ego was not subtle. It was structural. A king of Ur without inscriptions was as strange as a ziggurat without steps. Which is why the mask was so disturbing. It was too perfect to belong to a forgotten man. Too elaborate to belong to a minor official. Too royal to belong to a priest or merchant. This was a king, powerful king, but a king that history did not acknowledge. Why? While studying the mask, an art historian noticed an unusual detail. Around the inner edges, where the mask would have rested against the face of the deceased, tiny indents suggested fastenings. This mask was meant to be fixed tightly, not simply laid over the face. The pressure marks on the gold hinted at a snugness bordering on aggressive, as if someone had forced the mask into place. Even stranger, microscopic examinations revealed stress along one side of the jawline, evidence that the mask may have been pulled or bent at some point. This was not natural decay. This was deliberate force. Someone had attempted to remove the mask violently. If this was a sacred funerary object, why would anyone do that? If this was an honored king, why would anyone steal or damage his mask? If this was a revered figure, why erase his name? Every answer led to another question. Perhaps the most unsettling observation came from the mask's eyelashes. Tiny ridges engraved with obsessive delicacy. These were not stylized lines. They were individual strokes, as though the artisan had studied a real face closely, trying to capture its subtleties before the moment slipped away. It suggested urgency. It suggested intimacy. It suggested the mask was made for a man whose death was sudden. The lack of inscriptions suddenly made more sense. If the mask was created quickly, within days or even hours, there may not have been time for the traditional royal markings. But that explanation raised another issue. The craftsmanship was too perfect, too deliberate, too time-consuming to have been improvised. No matter how scholars approached it, contradictions bloomed. One detail in particular fueled speculation: the blue lapis eyebrows. Lapis was a sacred stone, symbolizing divine favor and celestial protection. Only the highest elite had access to it, and the eyebrows were carved in a style typically reserved for gods, not humans. It was as if the artisan was elevating this king to divine status, or trying to protect him from something beyond death. Some researchers proposed a chilling theory. The mask was created not to honor him, but to hide him, to disguise the identity of a murdered king, to conceal wounds, to maintain the illusion of royal continuity, to cover the face of a man whose death was not meant to be seen by the public. If true, the mask becomes a weapon in a political cover-up. A golden lie. Another theory suggested something even darker: that the king had committed a taboo or sacrilege so severe that the priests condemned his name to oblivion. Damnatio memoriae, erasure of memory, was rare but not unheard of in Mesopotamia. A king who betrayed the gods or threatened the priesthood could be removed from history with ruthless efficiency. But then why bury him in gold? Why honor a condemned man with the most exquisite funerary object of his age? Unless the golden burial was not an honor. Unless it was a prison, a way to bind his spirit, a way to contain him, a way to control what he represented. The mask, with its calm expression and radiant beauty, hides something. The silence is too deliberate, its perfection too suspicious, its anonymity too intentional. For a king to be forgotten in a civilization obsessed with remembrance, something extraordinary must have happened. Something powerful, something dangerous, something worth burying beneath gold. And the mask, beautiful, haunting, mysterious, now stands as the only witness left. Long before the golden mask emerged from the soil, long before scholars debated its origin or speculated about its secrets, the voices of ancient Sumer had already spoken. Etched not in gold, but in clay. Thousands of tablets, hardened by fire and preserved by accident, make up the earliest archive humanity has ever known. Through their wedge-shaped strokes, the people of Ur whispered stories of gods, kings, markets, floods, omens, and wars. They recorded debts, prayers, dreams, and even quarrels. They left behind a chorus of voices spanning centuries. And yet, among all these voices, among the poems, chronicles, and king lists, there is no mention of the man whose face now gleams in gold. He exists nowhere. Not in the Sumerian king list, which obsessively traces dynasties. Not in the temple records, which meticulously detail offerings to the gods. Not in the poetic epics, which immortalize rulers with mythic exaggeration. Not even in the accounting tablets, which document everything from grain storage to the number of sheep owned by palace officials. A king in Sumer could be erased from monuments. He could be condemned by priests. He could be killed and disposed of quietly. But to be missing from every record, every tablet, every inscription, that was nearly impossible. Unless it was intentional. The more scholars studied the tablets from the era surrounding the mask, the more puzzling the silence became. They expected at least a clue, a broken name, an unfinished sentence, even a stray symbol, but they found nothing. Entire collections of tablets referenced kings whose reigns lasted mere months. Even usurpers and failed rulers left traces of their existence in administrative records. But the masked king left only emptiness. This was not an accidental omission. It was a deliberate erasure. To understand the magnitude of that act, one must first understand how deeply the Sumerians valued memory. In their world, writing was sacred. A name carved in clay was eternal. A king's deeds, even terrible ones, were part of the cosmic balance. Their myths spoke of heroes who battled gods, kings who built cities, and rulers who angered the divine. Their stories were vibrant, complicated, contradictory, but they were told. Silence in Sumer was not normal, and yet the golden mask belonged to a man surrounded by it. This absence became even more striking when compared with the voices that survived. Stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh endured across thousands of years. A king of Uruk, rendered larger than life, half god, half man, who wrestled monsters, sought immortality, and confronted the meaning of existence. His tale was copied countless times. It survived beyond Sumer, influencing everything from biblical narratives to later heroic epics. Other kings, lesser known but still recorded, filled the annals of early Mesopotamian history. Kings like Enmebargesi of Kish, whose name appears in both myth and archaeology. Kings like Mesonepoda of Uar, who founded dynasties and stamped his name into thousands of clay bricks. Kings like Eannatum of Lagash, who carved his victories on the steel of the vultures. They are not myths. They are memories preserved in clay and stone. And yet, beside these towering figures, the golden mask stands alone. Real, tangible, undeniable, but disconnected from the written world around him. The contrast is haunting. Some scholars began searching for clues in the myths themselves. Ancient stories often carried fragments of forgotten history. A villain might be modeled after a real tyrant. A fallen king might be transformed into a monstrous figure. A taboo name might be replaced with metaphor. And in Sumerian literature, there are shadow figures whose identity is ambiguous. Rulers who appear only once, unnamed kings who cause catastrophe, mysterious figures punished by gods. Could the masked king be one of them? A forgotten inspiration behind a legend? One fragmentary text from the same era tells of a lord without a name, whose reign brought unrest to the land. Another mentions a moon king, whose memory was taken by divine judgment. These texts are cryptic, incomplete, frustratingly vague, but they gesture toward the possibility that the masked king's story survived not in history, but in metaphor. Across these fragments, one theme recurs. A ruler whose name is removed does not disappear. He becomes myth. He becomes warning. He becomes symbol. And yet the mask itself challenges this idea. Its realism defies myth. Its craftsmanship defies erasure. Its existence demands acknowledgement. But the records refuse. The deeper scholars delved into the tablets. The stranger the silence became. One tablet describes a sudden shift in palace authority, with no explanation. Another records a temple's complaint about unjust offerings during a specific year, but omits the responsible ruler. A sequence of tablets from a storage archive skips over a year entirely, as if someone had torn out the chapter of a book. These gaps, when aligned with the dating of the mask, create a troubling outline, a shadow where a king should stand. The tablets seem to say, something happened, but they refuse to say what or who. For a long time, scholars believed such omissions were accidental, lost tablets, damaged records, administrative pauses. But the discovery of the mask reshaped that perspective. The gaps were too convenient, the silence too targeted, the omissions too synchronized. It was as if the scribes had been ordered to erase every mention of a specific ruler, and they obeyed. Not by destroying tablets, those would leave physical traces, but by simply refusing to write his name again. An elegant deletion, a clean erasure. A king vanished not by fire or war, but by the quiet power of the written word withheld. And in a world where writing was the foundation of civilization, that was the most devastating punishment imaginable. But even in silence, clues survive. In the royal hymns of the moon god Nana, one line stands out: "The one who turned from the moon shall be forgotten." A symbolic phrase, perhaps, or perhaps a veiled reference. In the lamentation poems of Uar, a cryptic refrain appears: "A king without a record, a shadow among rulers." Fragments, hints, echoes. Together, they form a faint outline of the forgotten man. Just enough to tease his existence, just enough to suggest his downfall, but never enough to understand his story. And so the golden mask stands at the center of a paradox. A masterpiece belonging to a man erased. A face more vivid than the words that should explain it. A king whose silence rings louder than all the voices that survived. The clay tablets preserved everything: trade, prayers, myths, kings, everything except him. Whatever he did, whoever he angered, whatever power he once held, the scribes ensured that his name would never shape the future. They failed, because the mask, beautiful, mysterious, defiant, has outlived their silence. It has become his voice, and it calls us deeper into the darkened corridors of where truth waits behind ritual, power, betrayal, and the echo of a king made to vanish. Power in Sumer was never gentle. It flowed like the rivers that fed the land, shifting, branching, flooding unexpectedly. To rule a city like was to stand against forces both earthly and divine, to navigate a landscape shaped by rival kings, ambitious generals, calculating priests, and the will of gods who seemed to change their minds as often as the moon shifted shape. And in this world of unstable thrones, bloodlines meant everything. Dynasties in Sumer rose fast and fell faster. A king might rule for decades, or he might be murdered in a single night. Alliances formed through marriage or conquest were often broken before the ink dried on a clay treaty. The Sumerian king list reads less like a history book and more like a battlefield, filled with abrupt endings, mysterious interruptions, and periods where entire ruling families vanished from record. Behind these gaps were stories of betrayal, coups, assassinations, and dynasties erased to legitimize new rulers. This is the landscape into which the golden mask fits, a world so turbulent that a king could be exalted in one generation and forbidden from memory in the next. To understand how a ruler could be buried in gold yet erased from writing, we must understand the political atmosphere of early Sumer. Did not stand alone. Surrounding it were rival city-states, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, Umma, each fighting for power, territory, and prestige. When one city grew too strong, the others united to weaken it. When one king achieved too much influence, another king plotted a quiet removal. Rulers leaned heavily on priests, generals, and wealthy merchants, but those same groups often worked together to topple a king they no longer trusted. Even the gods were political weapons. A ruler claiming divine favor could inspire loyalty. A rival claiming divine anger could inspire rebellion. And in this complex world of shifting loyalties, bloodlines served both as shields and targets. Kings built their legitimacy on genealogy. To claim descent from a famous ancestor was to claim destiny. Dynasties were recorded with obsessive care, their lineage carved into monuments and recited in rituals. A king without a strong bloodline could lose the throne. A king whose lineage threatened the priesthood could be removed. The early dynasties of were especially fragile. The first dynasty, to which the masked king likely belonged, emerged during a period of intense political fragmentation. City-states fought constantly, not just with weapons, but with marriages, trade embargoes, and myth-making. Every throne room in Sumer was a battlefield hidden behind polished stone walls. If the golden mask belonged to a king from this era, his disappearance from records was not simply unusual, it was damning. Sumerians erased kings for three main reasons: illegitimacy, a ruler who seized the throne without divine or genealogical justification; religious offense, a king who angered the priesthood or violated sacred ritual; dynastic cleansing, when a new family took power, they often rewrote history to make the previous dynasty appear shorter, weaker, or non-existent. Any of these could explain the masked king's vanishing. But the way he was buried complicates the story. A usurper would likely be murdered and disposed of dishonorably. A religious offender might be denied burial rites entirely. A deposed king could be tossed into a mass grave or cremated to prevent veneration. Yet this man was buried in a royal chamber, surrounded by luxury. He was given attendants, sacrifices, and the most exquisite funerary mask ever found in Sumer. That is the contradiction. A king erased from record, but honored in death. A ruler condemned by history, but revered by those who buried him. Something deeper was at work. One theory suggests he belonged to a rival bloodline, a splinter branch of royal family whose existence threatened the official dynastic narrative. If so, his rivals may have allowed him an honorable burial but removed his name from every tablet to erase his claim. Another theory points to internal palace conflict. Perhaps he was not removed by outside enemies, but by his own court, betrayed by advisors, generals, or even family members who saw him as an obstacle to their own ambitions. In that case, the burial might have been performed secretly by supporters who still honored him. They could not record his name without risking their lives, but they could preserve his face. And then there is the theory tied to religion. The kings of Ur ruled not only the people but also rituals. They acted as mediators between the city and the gods. If a king interpreted an omen incorrectly, ignored a priestly decree, or failed to perform a crucial ritual, disasters could be blamed on him. Drought, disease, invasion. All could be seen as divine punishment for one man's mistake. If the masked king committed such an error, the priesthood may have demanded his name be erased from records as part of a purification ritual. This was not just punishment, it was cosmic correction. But again, why the golden burial? Because in Sumer, death rituals were layered with meaning. A king condemned in life could still be honored in death to appease divine forces. A burial mask could act as a spiritual containment device, sealing the dead and preventing their unrest from influencing the living. Gold, associated with divine purity, could neutralize taboo. Lapis accents could invoke protection from celestial powers. In this interpretation, the mask becomes not a tribute, but a seal. A way to bind a dangerous or tainted ruler. A way to protect the city from his lingering influence. A way to control the narrative not through writing but through ritual. The political tension of early Sumer makes such contradictions believable. Rulers were constantly navigating fault lines, between priestly authority and military might, between family loyalty and rival clans, between ancient traditions and new ambitions. It was a world where a king could be revered by half the city and despised by the other half. A world where the priesthood could elevate or destroy a ruler with a single proclamation from the temple. A world where a king might be crowned at sunrise and overthrown by nightfall. A world where loyalty was fragile, alliances unstable, and every throne was built on shifting sand. The golden mask fits perfectly into this turbulence. It is too elaborate to belong to a forgotten man. Too distinctive to belong to a ceremonial substitute. Too human to belong to a myth. Too anonymous to belong to a legitimate king. He was someone important, important enough to be remembered in gold, dangerous enough to be erased in writing. A king whose bloodline threatened others. A ruler whose legitimacy was contested. A sovereign whose death marked a turning point so fraught that scribes were ordered to remove his name entirely. The bloodlines of Sumer were tangled. The thrones were unstable. The dynasties were fragile. In such a world, the masked king may have stood at the center of a conflict so deep, so threatening, that his erasure was necessary to ensure the future of Ur. Yet the gold refused to forget him. And as the centuries passed, the mask waited, its silence louder than the voices of every king who survived in writing. The forgotten ruler's story did not end with his enemies. It simply went underground, waiting for the day when the world would look into the eyes of the mask and ask, who was he, and who wanted him gone so completely? Before the golden mask emerged from the shadows of its forgotten chamber, archaeologists had already encountered a burial so extraordinary that it seemed to belong to myth rather than history. Her name was Pwabi. Not the queen, not the wife of a king, not even consort. Simply, Pwabi, lady, noblewoman, priestess, ruler. Her tomb was intact, untouched, as though the desert itself had guarded her for thousands of years. When Woolley's team first entered her burial chamber, they were stunned. Gold shimmered from every corner. Beads, necklaces, headdresses, lyres, ceremonial bowls. It was a treasury fit for a deity. And in the center sat Pwabi herself, adorned in jewelry so intricate it looked like sunlight crystallized into metal. Her headdress alone was a masterpiece, layers of gold leaves cascading like frozen flames, capped with a towering crown of lapis and carnelian. She was posed with dignity, her spine straight, her face turned slightly upward. Even in death, she commanded the room. And yet, she was not called a queen. Her seal bore no king's name. Her identity stood alone. This made her a rare figure in Sumerian history, a woman whose power was not borrowed, inherited, or shared, but entirely her own. Scholars debated her title. Some believed she was a queen in all but name. Others argued she was a high priestess with political authority equal to a ruler. The truth, like everything from UR, was more complicated. Her presence in history raised a question that scholars have never fully answered. How did Pwabi rise so high in a world ruled by kings? The Sumerians practiced a form of sacred kingship, and while women held influence, especially in temples, they rarely achieved Pwabi's level of wealth and independence. Her tomb, untouched by looters, preserved her legacy with breathtaking clarity. She was adorned with craftsmanship equal to any king. Her attendants, who lay near her, were arranged with the same precision seen in the death pits, suggesting she, too, commanded ritual devotion. But as Woolley's team catalogued her treasures, one detail stood out. Her artifacts shared stylistic elements with those found near the golden mask. Lapis sourced from the same mines, gold alloyed with similar composition, motifs identical in technique, though distinct in symbolism. It was as if the mask and Pwabi were products of the same artistic revolution, made by workshops operating under the guidance of the same ruler, or at least the same cultural moment. But there was something even more striking. Pwabi's lineage was recorded. Her name was preserved. Her burial was celebrated. She remained visible in the written record, clear, honored, unforgettable. The masked king, however, was erased entirely. This contrast is one of the most enigmatic contradictions in the royal cemetery of UR. Pwabi, a woman of extraordinary status, retains her identity with astonishing clarity. The man with the most magnificent funerary mask of his age does not. The question becomes irresistible. What was the relationship between Pwabi and the masked king? Some scholars have suggested that Pwabi lived slightly earlier, perhaps a generation before the masked ruler. Others place them in overlapping timelines. A few theories even propose that Pwabi may have ruled during a transitional period, either as a queen regent or as a sovereign whose authority overshadowed weaker kings. If Pwabi indeed wielded real power, then the masked king may have been her descendant, her rival, or the man who sought to claim her legacy. Perhaps he inherited her court, her artisans, her wealth. Perhaps he tried to restore her vision. Perhaps he defied it. The truth remains buried in silence. But one detail has drawn particular attention. Pwabi's tomb was intact because no one erased her. This was not the case with the masked king. His chamber had collapsed partially, unnatural damage according to some researchers. His name was wiped from history. His burial, while rich, felt rushed compared to Pwabi's meticulous preparation. The death surrounding his chamber was chaotic, violent. Nothing about his final resting place carried the serenity found in hers. And yet, their artistic worlds overlap too perfectly for coincidence. The same workshops, the same metals, the same artisans' signatures in the flourishes of gold. Some have proposed that the masked king may have belonged to Pwabi's bloodline, a descendant whose claim to the throne threatened rival dynasties. If so, removing him from records might have been essential to solidify a new regime. But there is another possibility far darker. Perhaps the masked king overstepped, seeking to restore Pwabi's level of power or challenge the priesthood's control. If he invoked Pwabi's memory too strongly, the elites of UR might have seen him as a threat, not for what he failed to do, but for what he dared to attempt. In that case, his erasure would not mark a failure. It would mark a rebellion. And the gold laid over his face might not be honor, but containment. A ritual binding, a way to seal away his legacy, as the priesthood had no authority to destroy a ruler of royal blood outright. A way to grant him the burial his station required, while removing him from history. When placed beside Pwabi's pristine tomb, the golden mask becomes more than a symbol of forgotten royalty. It becomes a symbol of conflict between two visions of power in UR. One preserved, one erased, one celebrated, one condemned, one remembered, one silenced. Standing before Pwabi's treasures today, visitors are struck by how complete her world seems, how intact her story feels. But the more scholars understand her, the more they realize her legacy casts a long shadow over the mask's silence. Her preserved name and his erased name form a haunting pair. She is the known. He is the unknown. And somewhere in the space between their stories lies the reason the Golden Mask exists at all. For Pwabi represents stability, legitimacy, divine favor. The Masked King represents rupture, danger, taboo. But both shared a city, a dynasty, a cultural moment, and possibly a destiny intertwined more tightly than we yet understand. In the end, Pwabi's tomb answers as many questions as it raises. But one thing is clear. Before the king was forgotten, there was a queen remembered. And the Golden Mask may not only preserve the face of a lost ruler, it may also be the final echo of the world Pwabi helped shape. The gold of the mask was not just gold. It was a map. At first, researchers admired its beauty, its shimmering surface, its flawless hammering. But when they analyzed the metal more deeply, running samples through spectrometry, comparing isotopic signatures, studying the ratios of trace elements, a revelation emerged. The gold did not come from Ur. It did not come from Sumer. It did not even come from the lands immediately surrounding Mesopotamia. The gold of the mask came from far away, so far that it rewrote what scholars believed about early trade networks. One portion of the alloy bore the chemical fingerprints of eastern Anatolia. Another strain matched sources in ancient Iran. Still another trace indicated gold from Central Asian riverbeds, a region thousands of kilometers beyond the frontier of Sumerian influence. And this was only the beginning. Embedded in the eyebrows and beard were fragments of lapis lazuli, a stone so precious in the ancient world that it was valued more than gold itself. Its deep, celestial blue came exclusively from the Badakhshan mines in what is now Afghanistan. The discovery of lapis in the mask was not surprising on its own. Lapis was a known luxury of Sumer. But the quality of the lapis in this mask was unprecedented. The stones were purer, richer, cut with a level of precision exceeding any other artifact found at Ur. Each piece had been shaped so thinly it seemed impossible they hadn't cracked during placement. This required a master artisan, someone with tools and techniques more advanced than anything yet attributed to early Mesopotamian metalworkers. Then came the silver. Thin plates of silver lined the interior rim of the mask. Not decorative, but structural, reinforcing the gold where it might bend. The signature impurities in that silver pointed to mines in the Caucasus, far to the northwest. A trade route spanning mountains, deserts, rivers, and hostile territories must have carried this precious cargo to Ur. The mask was not simply an object of beauty. It was a statement of power on a global scale. Someone rich, someone influential, someone feared or beloved enough to command resources from the edges of the ancient world, had commissioned this masterpiece. And yet, this same someone was erased from every written record. This paradox deepened when researchers noticed something strange. One of the gold sources, an Iranian vein used significantly in the mask, stopped appearing in Sumerian artifacts during a very specific period. This disappearance was abrupt, sudden, almost violent. For decades, Sumer had imported gold, silver, lapis, and other materials from its neighbors through elaborate networks of trade caravans and merchant guilds. These relationships were stable, predictable. Even during times of war, trade in luxury goods often continued among elites. But at the approximate time suggested by the burial of the masked king, one crucial trade link snapped. The flow of Iranian gold ceased almost instantly, like a river blocked by an unseen dam. This anomaly puzzled scholars for years, until a new theory emerged. Something happened between Ur and its eastern trade partners. Something catastrophic. Something political. Something tied to the very man whose face was covered in gold. A war? A betrayal? A failed diplomatic alliance? Or a ruler who made decisions so catastrophic that his successors cut all ties and all memories of him? When historians placed this trade collapse alongside the dating of the mask, a disturbing timeline formed. The mask was forged at the height of Ur's wealth, and buried at the moment its alliances shattered. The question became unavoidable. Was the masked king responsible? One interpretation suggests that this ruler tried to redirect trade networks, perhaps seizing foreign merchants' assets, taxing caravans too heavily, or attempting to monopolize gold inflow to consolidate his own power? If so, rival city-states or foreign kingdoms may have retaliated swiftly. A more sinister possibility proposes that the king attempted a dangerous political marriage or foreign pact, alienating powerful factions at home. If the priesthood or aristocracy disapproved, they might have viewed such ambitions as treasonous. Then there is the darkest possibility of all, that the king tried to seize control over the temples, over the priests, omens, and sacred rituals that governed the economy as much as the divine. In Sumer, challenging the priesthood was suicide. If the masked king defied the temple of Nana or altered traditional offerings, foreign allies dependent on religious diplomacy might have severed ties. Trade relationships in the ancient world were often based on mutual religious recognition. Angering the gods meant angering your neighbors. The collapse of the Eastern Gold connection, therefore, could have been the direct result of the masked king's decisions. But if that were true, why craft such a magnificent mask for him? Why not condemn him openly? Why not leave him unburied? Why not mark his grave with shame instead of gold? The answer may lie in the nature of Sumerian politics. Kings could be despised by the elites yet revered by segments of the population. A ruler could be executed by priests but mourned by soldiers. Or, as one controversial theory suggests, the king may not have died naturally at all. Perhaps he was assassinated, quietly removed to restore trade stability, and buried lavishly to appease powerful factions who still supported him. His burial could have been a compromise. Honor the man, erase the reign, respect the dead, but remove the danger of his memory. Even the composition of the mask reflects this contradiction. The diversity of materials, gold, lapis, silver, speaks to vast connections. But those connections fell apart immediately after his death, as if the foreign world had severed ties with the moment the king fell. Some researchers believe the masked king might have been especially beloved by foreign allies, possibly half foreign himself. If he represented a bridge between and distant lands, his death would have symbolized the collapse of that bridge. The sudden absence of Iranian gold, then, becomes not just an economic anomaly, but a political obituary. A foreign empire withdrawing in grief, anger, or fear. A diplomatic rupture so severe that it reverberated across trade routes. A silent acknowledgement that a turning point had occurred. In this light, the mask becomes a relic of a golden age that ended abruptly, not because of natural disaster, but because of a human fall. A downfall so dramatic that scribes refused to record it. A collapse so profound that the world around shifted in its wake. And yet the gold remains, impartial, indestructible, undeniable. It speaks through its origins, its purity, its pigments, its fractures. It tells the story the tablets refuse to tell. The mask is a contradiction. An object forged at the height of power, buried at its moment of fracture, preserved through centuries, and rediscovered only when the world was finally ready to ask what happened. And perhaps the most haunting detail of all is this. While the trade networks collapsed at the edges of Sumer, inside the city someone still chose to bury the masked king in splendor. Someone protected his face in gold. Someone preserved the artistry of foreign lands upon him. Someone ensured that even if his name disappeared, his presence would not. The gold shouldn't be there. The lapis shouldn't be there. The silver shouldn't be there. But they are. And together, they whisper a truth deeper than any inscription could offer. The king was forgotten by history, but remembered fiercely by someone who refused to let him vanish completely. The Sumerians did not separate history from myth. To them, legends were not distant fantasies. They were echoes, distorted memories of events that had once shaken the world. The gods walked beside kings. Heroes carried the weight of real wars in their stories. And every ruler, no matter how human, existed in a landscape shaped by celestial will and divine intervention. So when scholars searched for the forgotten king, the man behind the golden mask, they naturally turned to the epics and poems of ancient Mesopotamia. And there, buried inside the tangled verses of mythology, they found shadows. Not explicit references, not names or dates, but echoes. faint outlines of figures whose stories resembled what little could be inferred about the masked king. The first and most obvious place to look was the Epic of Gilgamesh. Though composed centuries later, parts of it draw from much older oral traditions. Gilgamesh himself, the mighty king of Uruk, is described as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. His adventures are mythic, but the emotional core of his story, his struggle with mortality, kingship, and legacy, reflects the anxieties of real rulers who came long before him. In the earliest Sumerian versions of the epic, Gilgamesh clashes with rivals, kings, warriors, spirits, who challenge his authority. These rivals are rarely named. Instead, they are described in fragments. A king whose identity was lost to time, a lord whose face was covered, a ruler punished by heaven. Those phrases were always dismissed as poetic embellishment. But after the golden mask was found, they gained new weight. One fragment in particular drew attention. It speaks of a ruler whose visage was shrouded in the gleam of the moon, yet unknown to the scribes. Another describes a king who ruled in shadow, a phrase scholars once thought referred to an eclipse. Now, many wonder if this imagery echoes the political erasure of a real figure from Sumer's early dynasties. Could the unnamed adversaries of Gilgamesh represent forgotten kings, one of whom may have been the man behind the mask? Not as gods or monsters, but as political rivals mythologized over centuries. If so, then the golden mask is not just an artifact. It is the physical remnant of a story that lived on indirectly transformed into metaphor. Beyond Gilgamesh, other Sumerian myths contain peculiar descriptions of rulers whose identities were removed. In the tale known as the Lament of Uar, a passage speaks of a king whose name was taken by the winds and whose years were not counted. These phrases match no historical figure. They appear only once, in a text otherwise focused on the destruction of the city by invading forces. The timing of that destruction aligns roughly with the era the mask is believed to come from. Another poem, fragmentary, damaged, barely legible, mentions the moon's chosen who betrayed his oath. Scholars debate its interpretation. Some believe it refers to a mythic priest. Others think it could be a reference to a ruler associated with the moon god Nana, Uar's patron deity. Given the lunar motifs on the mask, this connection is hard to ignore. But it is in a lesser-known myth that the most tantalizing hint appears. In a text called The Curse of Agade, which describes the downfall of a later Akkadian city, there is an unusual aside, one that doesn't quite fit the rest of the narrative. It speaks of a time long before, when a king of Uar was erased for angering the heavens. The line is cryptic, out of place, and widely believed to reference a much older story. For decades, it was considered symbolic. But now, after the discovery of the mask, its literal meaning seems far more plausible. A king of Uar, erased, punished, condemned. The parallels are impossible to ignore. Still, the most haunting connection comes from a set of teaching tablets used by scribal apprentices. Among their practice texts are moral lessons disguised as short parables, intended to warn future bureaucrats about the dangers of arrogance and impiety. One of these parables tells of a king whose golden face hid a treacherous heart. The resemblance to the physical mask is striking, almost eerie. Was the scribal parable inspired by the forgotten king? Was the mask itself legendary long before it was rediscovered? Did storytellers preserve fragments of a taboo history through coded metaphors? If so, the king may not have been forgotten, only transformed. Scholars analyzing these texts found something remarkable. Whenever the myths mention a forgotten ruler, they emphasize one of two themes. 1. The ruler lost the favor of the gods. Or 2. The ruler's achievements were stolen or suppressed by rivals. Both themes align with the political turbulence surrounding the masked king's era. One myth describes a ruler whose voice was sealed in silence, suggesting erasure rather than death. Another tells of a king who walked into the earth alone, a metaphor for descending into a tomb without attendants, something that contradicts the masked king's burial, where attendants died with him. So were these myths referencing multiple forgotten kings? Or were they distorting, fragmenting, reshuffling memories of a single ruler whose burial and erasure defied typical patterns? Even more fascinating are the supernatural descriptions. A king who looked upon the moon and was judged. A king who sought knowledge forbidden to men. A king who feared no god and feared no death. These phrases reflect archetypes but also individual stories. If the masked king attempted reforms, challenged priests, or altered rituals, the myths may have encoded his actions as cosmic rebellion. It would not be the first time a political conflict became a mythic battle. And so, scholars began comparing the physical mask with the mythic language. The lapis eyebrows evoke divine wisdom. The gold face suggests purity or divine favor. The expression, serene yet stern, matches descriptions of rulers who carried both charisma and danger. The lack of inscriptions mirrors myths of kings without a record. The evidence is circumstantial, yet persuasive. What if the forgotten king survived in stories long after his name vanished? What if ancient writers retold his fate in veiled terms to avoid angering the powerful priesthood or the reigning dynasty? What if every mythic fragment, every unnamed king, every punished lord, every shadow ruler was a piece of him? It is possible, perhaps even likely, that the masked king lives on in the epics as a distorted reflection. Not as himself, but as a character shaped by centuries of storytelling. He may be the cautionary figure behind a moral tale, the unnamed antagonist in an early version of Gilgamesh, the silent king condemned in a lamentation, the mythic warning scribes whispered to young apprentices. His story may not be absent. It may be everywhere, hidden, disguised, fragmented, but alive. The golden mask, with its unnerving realism, becomes a bridge between myth and history, a face returning to reclaim the stories that once distorted him. If the myths hold truth, then the king was not simply erased. He was transformed. And now, after thousands of years of silence, the physical truth of his face rises from the sand to challenge the stories that once buried him. Long before the golden mask was lifted from its collapsing chamber, long before scholars searched for the identity it once protected, the world around UR had already begun to fall apart. What later generations would call the great collapse of the First Dynasty did not come suddenly. It crept in quietly, invisibly, like a shadow growing across the face of a bright and prosperous kingdom. In the beginning, the signs were subtle. The rains came a little later than usual. The river carried less silt, making the soil slightly harder to plow. The barley harvest dipped, not drastically, but enough for palace officials to worry. A few tablets from this period mention shortages in temple offerings or complaints about water allocations. Nothing alarming on its own. But beneath these scattered hints lay the early tremors of a much larger catastrophe. The land of Sumer had always relied on the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. The rivers were lifelines, carrying water to fields, linking cities, feeding livestock, connecting trade routes. The earliest kings built their power by controlling canals and regulating irrigation. But nature does not bow to kings. If the rivers shifted even slightly, entire cities could suffer. Around the time the masked king likely reigned, the rivers began to change course. Slowly at first, then more dramatically. A canal that once supplied UR's fields grew shallow. Another dried entirely. Farmers who had relied on predictable water cycles suddenly found themselves desperate. Crops failed. Livestock weakened. Famine loomed. And when hunger enters a kingdom, loyalty becomes fragile. This ecological instability triggered a chain reaction. Merchants began reporting caravans arriving late or not at all. Foreign envoys demanded grain shipments that UR could no longer afford to send. Temple priests, whose rituals depended on abundant offerings, warned that the gods were displeased. They saw omens everywhere, in the erratic winds, in the behavior of sacrificial animals, even in the moon's unusual hue during certain nights. The moon god Nana, patron of UR, was believed to communicate through light and shadow. Priests interpreted these signs carefully. So when the moon dimmed behind dust storms, or when its crescent appeared sharp and blood-red, they feared divine anger. And when priests fear, kings bleed. The political landscape across Sumer grew volatile. Rival city-states sensed weakness. Umma renewed its territorial disputes. Lagash seized border canals. Kish sent emissaries whose messages, a mix of diplomacy and veiled threats, hinted that they believed Uar's strength was fading. Inside the palace, tensions rose. Grain shortages sparked internal disputes. Advisors blamed generals. Generals blamed merchants. Merchants blamed priests. And priests blamed the king. Whoever the masked ruler was, he would have faced a storm of crises converging at once. Famine, failing trade, hostile neighbors, and religious unrest. In such times, a king had only two choices: restore order or be removed. Some scholars believe the masked king attempted bold reforms, redistributing land, reorganizing irrigation, or centralizing authority to stabilize the collapsing system. If so, he likely met fierce resistance from powerful noble families whose wealth depended on controlling specific regions and water routes. Others think he struggled with indecision, unable to address the spiraling chaos. In a kingdom built on the illusion of divine-sanctioned stability, hesitation was lethal. But the most controversial theory proposes something far more dramatic: that the masked king became a scapegoat. In the ancient world, when disaster struck, the king was the bridge between humanity and the divine. If the gods were angry, people believed the king had failed. And the priesthood, keepers of celestial law, held the authority to interpret divine judgment. It is possible, even likely, that the collapse of Uar's prosperity was blamed on the masked king. Whether he deserved that blame is another story. One incomplete tablet, damaged, cracked, barely legible, speaks of a ruler who ignored the words of the temple during a year of hardship. The tablet does not name the ruler, but its timing sits eerily close to the period in which the mask was crafted. If this unnamed ruler challenged the priests or refused their guidance, his downfall would have been swift. The collapse hastened. Fields that once shimmered with grain lay barren. The fishing districts along the marshes reported dying reeds and shrinking water levels. Dust storms swept across the plains, choking cattle and burying roads. Trade routes shifted as foreign merchants chose more stable cities. Then came the final blow: a sudden, devastating invasion. The exact enemy remains debated. Some believe it was a coalition of rival Sumerian cities. Others argue it was a semi-nomadic group from the west or north. Whoever they were, they struck when Uar was weakest, when famine, drought, and political tension had hollowed the city from within. The invaders breached one of the outer walls. Panic swept through the streets. Families barricaded their homes. Soldiers retreated to protect the core districts. The palace prepared for siege. If the masked king was alive during this moment, he would have stood at the center of a crumbling world. His choices would have determined the fate of thousands, and ultimately the fate of his legacy. Some imagine him fighting valiantly, trying to rally his people. Others envision a king paralyzed by fear or overwhelmed by treachery within his own ranks. Still others picture him betrayed, killed not by invaders, but by those who claimed to defend the city. One thing is clear: the collapse of the First Dynasty coincides almost perfectly with the burial of the Golden Mask. The city eventually survived, rebuilt, and rose again under later rulers. But the dynasty associated with the masked king ended abruptly. Clean break, a deliberate reset, a rewriting of history. When Uar recovered, the scribes who documented the new rulers made no mention of the king who fell during the collapse. His reign was treated like a void, a shameful chapter closed too tightly to reopen. This silence is not mere accident. It is intentional. It is political. It is punishment. The priests, seeking to explain the catastrophe, may have declared the king cursed. The aristocrats, eager to justify their own rise to power, may have erased his contributions. The next dynasty, eager to project stability, may have destroyed whatever records remained of his rule. Erase the king and you erase the blame. Erase the blame and you restore divine order. Erase the past and you secure the future. The Golden Mask, crafted with such care, sourced from such distant lands, became the only surviving witness to a reign that ended in chaos. Its burial suggests something profound. Despite the collapse, despite the blame, despite the erasure, Someone still honored the king in death. A faction loyal to him? A grieving family? A group trying to appease the gods? Or artisans who believed the king deserved dignity even if history rejected him? Whatever the reason, his burial chamber became a quiet rebellion against official history. A refusal to let the king vanish completely. The collapse of the first dynasty of Ur wasn't just a political or economic disaster. It was a psychological one. A trauma that reshaped the identity of the city. A moment so painful that scribes tried to erase the memory of those responsible or those blamed. The mask survived the collapse. The face survived the erasure. The story survived the silence. And now, as archaeologists piece together the evidence, ecological, political, mythic, they see the outline of a king standing at the crossroads of disaster. A king whose reign was swallowed by collapse. A king whose memory was swallowed by politics. A king whose face was swallowed by gold. The Great Collapse did not just end a dynasty. It transformed a king into a mystery. One that would wait 4,000 years to be rediscovered. For decades, Sir Leonard Woolley was celebrated as one of archaeology's great storytellers. His discoveries at Ur dazzled the world. Treasures untouched for 4,000 years, royal tombs glittering with gold, ritual death pits arranged like tragic theater. Newspapers hailed him, museums praised him, scholars followed his every publication. But history has a way of circling back. And the narrative Woolley crafted began to show cracks. Thin at first, then widening, revealing shadows he never spoke of. Shadows he might have deliberately obscured. To understand what Woolley omitted, one must understand the era in which he worked. His excavation took place in the 1920s, under British oversight in newly formed Iraq. Archaeology was not just science then, it was politics, propaganda, national pride. Great powers competed not only for land, but for ancient glory. Every discovery became a symbol. Every story was shaped to appeal to donors, governments, and the public imagination. Woolley knew this better than anyone. He understood that discoveries were not enough. They needed narratives. Clean, elegant, dramatic narratives. The kind that newspapers would print in bold letters. The kind that museum boards would fund. The kind that made archaeology look heroic rather than chaotic, uncertain, or violent. So when Woolley uncovered the royal cemetery, he crafted a story that fit this mold. The noble ritual of a glorious civilization. Servants willingly walking into death. Musicians lying peacefully beside their instruments. A king buried with splendor. A queen resting in eternal dignity. It was beautiful. It was dramatic. It was easy to tell. And it was wrong. Modern forensics have exposed many truths Woolley either dismissed or chose not to emphasize. The fractures on skulls. The signs of struggle. The toxins in cups. The chaotic positioning of bodies in some pits. The evidence of violence, coercion, and disruption. But Woolley's omissions went deeper than misinterpreted bones. There are notes in his unpublished journals, scribbled observations he never included in his polished reports. Mentions of collapsed chambers that looked intentionally destroyed. Wood fragments showing signs of burning, unaccounted for in the official narrative. Ceremonial objects shattered in patterns inconsistent with long-term decay. Even a cryptic line referring to disorder at the upper layer, clearly not part of ritual. What did he see there? What did he infer? And why did he not say it? Part of the answer lies in his times. The idea that early Sumerian kings commanded mass suicide of attendants in a peaceful ceremony was romantic in an exotic, tragic way, exactly the kind of narrative European audiences craved. But the idea that an ancient palace had collapsed in political violence, betrayal, and murder, that a king's death was not ritual but coup, that the tombs contained evidence of chaos rather than ceremony, that was too unsettling, too complex, too political. Woolley needed a clean story. A noble story, something that presented Ur as a shining early civilization, not as a kingdom torn apart by its own elite. Thus, the chaotic burials were reframed as ritual imperfections. The signs of struggle were explained away as settling of soil. The broken objects were labeled damage from collapse. And the golden mask, when it first appeared, was treated with similar caution. Woolley described the chamber as collapsed by natural forces. But one of his early letters, later discovered in a museum archive, hints at something different. He writes, "The damage seems deliberate, almost careful, as though the chamber was undone with intention." He never elaborated. He never said those words publicly. But that single sentence reveals something. Woolley suspected the tomb had been tampered with before burial was complete, or just after. Why omit this? Because it contradicted his monolithic narrative of ritual and order. A tomb sealed under conflict suggested turmoil, suggested betrayal, suggested cover-up. This did not fit the story he needed to tell. Another detail he glossed over: the absence of inscriptions identifying the masked king. Woolley mentioned it as curious. Nothing more. Yet in private notes he seemed baffled. Such craftsmanship would not be anonymous. Why no name? This grave is royal without doubt, and yet it pretends otherwise. Was erasure part of the burial? Questions that go unanswered in his official writings. Then there are the missing artifacts. Several items documented in Woolley's early field sketches never appeared in museum lists. A set of carved bone plaques, a silver emblem with lunar symbolism, an inscribed lapis fragment snapped in half at the edge where a name might have been. In later publications, these objects are simply absent. Woolley provided no explanation. Were they lost, destroyed, hidden, or were they deemed too troubling, too suggestive of a story more violent than ritual sacrifice? It would not be the first time an archaeologist curated silence. One must also consider the political pressure Woolley worked under. British authorities wanted finds that glorified humanity's earliest civilization, something to justify imperial presence in the region. They wanted stories of noble kings, not erased ones. Stories of grandeur, not collapse. Stories of harmony, not rivalry. A forgotten king with a shattered dynasty was inconvenient. A violent death ritual was inconvenient. A mask with no name was inconvenient. Better to emphasize beauty and devotion. Better to let the darker pieces fade into the background. Yet Woolley was too skilled, too observant, not to notice contradictions. He simply chose not to amplify them. Maybe he feared losing funding. Maybe he feared controversy. Maybe he felt the world wasn't ready. Or perhaps, just perhaps, he didn't understand the full significance and avoided speculation. But now, a century later, the pieces he omitted come together in ways he never anticipated. The chaotic burials, the foreign materials, the collapsed chamber, the missing name, the timeline of the dynasty's fall, the violence hidden beneath beauty. Taken together, they paint a far different picture of UR. Not one of serene ritual, but one of political upheaval, religious conflict, and a forgotten king buried in gold because his legacy was too dangerous to preserve. Woolley uncovered extraordinary truths, but he also stood at the edge of a much darker revelation, one he chose not to step into. Now, with modern technology, forensic analysis, and a willingness to question the old stories, we step where he did not. Into the hidden history Woolley left behind. Into the shadows he brushed aside. Into the truth that the golden mask has waited to reveal. For years, the golden mask was admired the way a work of art is admired. Measured, photographed, polished, and catalogued. Scholars marveled at its craftsmanship, the purity of its gold, the way its smooth surface survived 40 centuries beneath the sand. But it wasn't until modern forensic techniques touched its surface that the mask finally began to speak. Not with inscriptions or symbols, but with wounds, tiny, microscopic, invisible to the naked eye. Beneath the polished gold, a story waited. At first glance, the mask seemed flawless. The contours were perfect, the surfaces seamless, the curves expertly hammered. But when a high-resolution laser scan traced across the cheek, a barely perceptible ripple appeared, an indentation so faint it had escaped decades of study. Under magnification, it revealed what the human eye could not see. Pressure marks. Gold is soft. Gold remembers. Every force ever applied to it leaves a fingerprint. Hammer strokes, bending, twisting, impact. The mask preserved these memories like scar tissue. And those scars suggested one thing. The mask had been removed violently from a body after death, or during it. When the interior was scanned, the evidence became clearer. At the upper right edge, where the mask would have rested against the temple, the gold bore a thin, irregular fracture. Not a clean break, but the kind created when metal is pried away. The fracture extended in a subtle tear along the jawline, as if fingers or tools had slipped beneath the edge and pulled with force. This was not burial damage. Not decay. Not collapse. It was deliberate action. Hands. Tools. Pressure. Someone tried to remove the mask. But why? No one removes a funerary mask unless they fear what it represents, or unless they wish to hide something beneath it. Forensic specialists noticed something else. Faint chemical traces inside the mask. They did not match natural decomposition. They resembled the residue of bombs or oils, but of an unusual composition, thicker, darker, possibly used to treat or conceal injuries on the face of the deceased. Was the king's face damaged, disfigured, wounded in a way that needed hiding, or had he suffered a violent death? The more analysts probed, the more troubling the details became. Inside the nose cavity, microscopic grains of soil appeared in an unusual pattern. Instead of drifting in naturally, they seemed packed, forced into place. The positioning suggested the body had been manipulated after burial preparations began. Soil does not behave this way unless someone moves the mask while the body is still fresh. On the left cheek, tiny abrasions matched the pattern of fingernails. Human fingernails. Someone had clawed at the mask. The scratches were faint, but unmistakable, thin, crescent-shaped, desperate marks etched into gold. Marks that could not have been made centuries later by accident. They were too specific, too purposeful. The thought is chilling. Did the king struggle as the mask was placed over his face? Did he resist? Did he try to pull it off? Or was it someone else? Someone fighting in the chaos of the burial chamber. Perhaps trying to save him or uncover him or destroy him. The temple bomb residues deepened the mystery. Tests suggested the oils were mixed with an unusual binding compound rarely used in Sumerian funerary rites. This compound appeared only in rituals involving purification. Rituals performed when death was considered unclean, violent, or politically dangerous. A king of natural death received standard embalming. A king of dishonor received none. But a king whose death was polluted, a coup, a murder, a broken taboo, required cleansing. The mask was part of that cleansing. But the gold itself betrayed the attempt. Under ultraviolet light, patterns of microscratches revealed the rhythm of hammer strokes. These were consistent with artisans working quickly. Not over weeks, but perhaps over days. Maybe even hours. The mask's perfection was deceptive. Beneath it lay the frantic energy of rushed craftsmanship. To create such a masterpiece in so little time required a workshop under immense pressure, whether political, religious, or both. Time was running out when they made this mask. Something had happened that required burial, swift, ornate, definitive. The mask's interior told another story. Temperature analysis suggested uneven heating, indicating that the mask had been repaired at least once, likely before burial. The repairs were crude compared to the masterful hammering on the surface. Patches of gold pressed roughly from within. What caused the damage requiring repair? Impact? Conflict? A struggle in the palace during the king's final hours? Or was the mask damaged because it was ripped off the king's face after he died? Another detail troubled researchers. Traces of moisture patterns on the gold indicated contact not only with bombs, but with tears or water from the eyes. The presence of moisture beneath the mask suggested it had been placed on the body while the face was still fresh. Very fresh. This implies the burial was rushed. Too rushed for inscriptions. Too rushed for ritual. Too rushed for stability. Then came an even more disturbing discovery. Infrared scans revealed faint discoloration near the chin, remnants of organic material embedded in microscopic pores in the gold. DNA analysis was impossible due to degradation, but the composition indicated the possibility of dried blood. If true, then the face beneath the mask had been bleeding when covered. Kings do not bleed peacefully. They bleed in violence. The mask is a masterpiece, but beneath its artistry lies the unmistakable signature of turmoil. Scholars began reconstructing possible scenarios. One possibility: the king was assassinated. His enemies tried to remove the mask, a symbol of royal legitimacy, to shame him or steal its gold. Loyalists intervened, forcing them away. In the aftermath, priests repaired the mask and sealed it on his face, fearing the god's wrath if the king was left unprotected. Another scenario: the king died in ritual or battle. His face was disfigured. The mask was placed quickly to preserve the illusion of divine favor. Later, someone, perhaps a rival faction, attempted to remove it to expose the truth before being stopped. A darker possibility: he was buried alive. The scratches inside raised this haunting thought, though no evidence confirms it. But the desperation in those fingernail marks, the unusual positioning of the soil, the rushed mask, the fractured interior, some scholars whisper it quietly, unwilling to publish the theory. But the gold remembers what humans wish to forget. The final clue lay in the mask's symmetry. On the surface, its features appear perfect, balanced, controlled. But when measured with precision instruments, the left side droops by less than a millimeter. Not enough to see by eye, but enough to indicate the artisan copied a real face, a real person whose muscles may have tensed unevenly at the moment of death. Tension like this appears in bodies that die suddenly, violently, in fear. The mask is not serene. It is frozen. It is the last expression of a man caught between life and death. When the artisans hammered the gold across his features, they preserved the final tension of his flesh. They did not create the expression. They captured it. Behind the mask's calm surface lies the echo of a terrified king. The microscratches, the fractures, the nail marks, the rushed repairs, the blood traces, they all converge into one truth. The man behind the golden mask did not die peacefully. He did not die naturally. He did not die in ritual stillness. He died in violence, secrecy, or betrayal, and someone desperately tried to hide it. The mask was meant to preserve him, but instead it preserved the crime. And after 4,000 years of silence, the gold finally speaks. When scholars first examined the golden mask, they assumed the king it represented must have been born in Ur, rooted in Sumerian tradition, shaped by its rituals, and crowned by its priests. But the more they studied the mask's features, the more something began to feel wrong, or rather unfamiliar. The proportions were slightly different from typical Sumerian royal depictions. The cheekbones were sharper, the jawline narrower. The curve of the eyes echoed a style common not in Ur, but beyond Sumer's borders. It was as if the face carved into the gold belonged to a stranger in the throne room. At first, these deviations were dismissed as artistic experimentation. But certain patterns kept emerging, subtle, consistent, unmistakable. The artisans of Ur were not known for sudden innovation without reason. Their styles evolved slowly, guided by tradition. Yet the mask contained elements that did not appear in any other artifact of its era. The eyebrows, for example, were shaped in a way more common in northern Mesopotamia and ancient Anatolia. The nose had a ridge line that resembled statuary from the Zagros foothills. Even the way the beard outline curved matched artistic conventions from regions east of Sumer. These were not coincidences. These were fingerprints of influence. As researchers compared the mask's features with those of statues and reliefs across the ancient Near East, a theory emerged, quietly at first, then with increasing confidence. The king behind the golden mask may not have been Sumerian at all. He may have been a foreigner, an outsider who seized the throne of Ur. The implications were staggering. If true, this would explain almost everything. The erased name, the missing inscriptions, the fractured political alliances, the hostility embedded in the burial, the collapse of foreign trade, the violent death hidden beneath gold. For a foreigner to claim the throne of Ur would have been unprecedented, unless he took power through force or exploited a moment of instability. And the era the mask likely comes from was full of instability. Drought, famine, internal conflict, and shifting political alliances. A strong outsider, perhaps a general, a noble, a foreign ally, might have seized the moment. But if he did, then his rule would have been contested from the beginning. Imagine it. A foreign ruler entering the sacred throne room of Uar. A man whose accent carried hints of mountains or deserts beyond Sumer. A man the people did not recognize as legitimate. A man the priests might have feared. A man the aristocratic families resented. A man whose every decision challenged the traditions the city held sacred. He would have been watched, whispered about, resented in silence. And yet he must have been powerful. To command artisans capable of crafting such a mask. To obtain foreign gold. To attract allies beyond the borders. To demand loyalty from soldiers who followed him into the palace. He was not a mere intruder. He was a conqueror or a savior depending on who told the story. Some scholars think he may have come as a protector, perhaps invited by a faction within Uar seeking to stabilize the city. But alliances of convenience often turn into battles for power. A protector can become a ruler overnight. A guest can become a threat. Others believe he arrived as a military conqueror, part of a foreign coalition that stormed the city during a moment of ecological collapse and political weakness. If so, his rule may have been swift and turbulent, marked by resistance, assassinations, or uprisings. But the most compelling evidence lies not in the mask's features, but in something more subtle, the style of the burial itself. Certain elements of the masked king's tomb resemble burial traditions from regions outside Sumer, especially the layout of personal weapons and ritual objects. The placement of certain gold ornaments mirrors burial customs from eastern highlands rather than the southern Mesopotamian plain. Even the orientation of the tomb, slightly rotated compared to typical royal burials, aligns more with foreign practices than Sumerian norms. These deviations might have been overlooked if the mask's face matched the typical royal ideal. But it didn't. It carried the unmistakable signature of an outsider. If the masked king was indeed foreign, the violent marks inside the mask make even more sense. He may have died not as a revered ruler but as a deposed one, killed in a palace coup, or executed by priests who insisted his reign defied divine order, or betrayed by generals who feared losing their own influence. In the chaos of his overthrow, someone may have attempted to tear the mask away, to expose his foreign features, to humiliate him, to strip him of legitimacy. The nail marks inside the gold may not be his own, but the marks of someone dragging him from the throne. But someone else, perhaps loyalists, perhaps his own family, reclaimed the body. They restored the mask. They buried him in gold. They honored him even as the city rejected him. The tension in the mask's construction, its rushed craftsmanship paired with extraordinary skill, makes perfect sense if power changed hands violently. The artisans would have worked quickly, perhaps in secret, before the new regime could prevent the burial. The absence of inscriptions is also explained. No scribe loyal to the city would inscribe the name of a foreign usurper. To do so would risk divine anger or political retribution. Better to leave the tomb unnamed. Better to erase the king. Better to pretend the reign never happened. And so, the golden mask became both tribute and concealment. A gift of honor from those who loved him. A tool of erasure from those who hated him. In some ways, the mask itself symbolizes his reign. Magnificent, unprecedented, foreign, contested, dangerous, forgotten. But one detail stands out above all. The presence of Anatolian and Iranian gold in the mask suggests strong connections to those regions. Either he was allied with them or he came from among them. Some researchers believe he was a warrior from the mountains of the Zagros, elevated to power through conquest or marriage. Others think he may have been part of a mercenary force hired by a faction within Uar, only to seize the throne themselves. Still others propose he was sent by a foreign king, perhaps as part of a diplomatic exchange that collapsed into political takeover. But the most haunting theory is this: the masked king was a bridge between worlds, a ruler trying to unify cultures, trade networks, and traditions, a man ahead of his time, and because of that, a man targeted by those terrified of change. If he was foreign, the priests would have hated him. If he challenged the temples, the aristocrats would have feared him. If he altered trade alliances, the merchants would have turned against him. If he brought foreign soldiers, the people would have viewed him with suspicion. His downfall becomes inevitable. When he died, whether by coup, assassination, or ritual execution, the new rulers erased him from records, tore his name from the king lists, and purged his lineage from the city's memory. Only the mask remained, hidden, imperfect, scarred, a stranger's face buried in the heart of Ur. And now, thousands of years later, the stranger is staring back. The fragment was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. A rectangle of baked clay, chipped at the edges, its surface cracked like ancient skin. At first glance, it looked no different from the thousands of tablets dug from the soils of Mesopotamia, lists of barley rations, temple inventories, hymns half erased by time. But when the dust was brushed away, when the faint symbols were traced under a low lantern, the team realized this was something else entirely. The inscription was rare, strange, almost unsettling. It mentioned a king but not by name. Instead, it used a phrase almost never seen in Sumerian texts, a phrase scholars had long struggled to interpret. The Moon King whose name was taken by the heavens. The fragment, now called the Tablet of Ashmore, was found decades after Woolley's excavation. Discovered in a private collection, its origin uncertain, its path from soil to museum shrouded in mystery. Some said it had been smuggled from a site near Ur. Others claimed it was part of a larger archival cache lost in the early 20th century. Whatever its journey, the words it carried cracked open a door scholars had long kept closed. The story on the tablet was incomplete, but powerful. It described a ruler who shone like the moon, yet bore a shadow upon his throne. It spoke of the year of the broken water, a phrase that matched other tablets describing the period of ecological collapse. It mentioned famine, unrest, omens. And then it delivered the line that had haunted translators for years. His name was lifted from the lists, for Nana judged him unfit. At first, many dismissed the line as myth, poetic exaggeration, symbolic language. But after the golden mask resurfaced, after historians realized how many silences surrounded the masked king's life and death, the tablet took on new meaning. What if it wasn't metaphor? What if it wasn't myth? What if it was history, blurred, fragmented, but real? The more researchers studied the tablet, the more intriguing its details became. The handwriting belonged not to a scribe in training, but to a high-ranking temple writer. The phrasing followed a formal structure used only in royal chronicles or divine judgments. Even the clay matched the composition typical of archives kept at major temples. But the most mysterious detail was the tablet's final line, cut in half by a break across the clay. And his face was hidden in gold, for the people must not see. The sentence ended abruptly, shattered by time. But the implication was strong enough to electrify scholars. A king's face, hidden, in gold, because the people must not see. What? A wound? A foreigner? A cursed expression? A taboo death? A crime written in bone? No one could say for sure. But the fragment fit too well with what had already been discovered in the tombs. Too well with the fractures in the mask. Too well with the political upheaval of the era. Most tantalizing of all, the tablet mentioned a name, Ashmore, not the king's name, but the name of the scribe or the archive that produced the document. This small detail provided scholars with a new lead. A group of linguists traced the name to a little-known administrative district near the Great Ziggurat of Ur, an area once home to a scribal school dedicated to recording omens, lunar cycles, and judgments issued by temple councils. If the tablet of Ashmore came from that archive, then it was likely not poetry at all. It was a verdict, a legal declaration, a divine condemnation officially recorded and archived, but later removed, broken, scattered, or buried to hide the truth. This linked perfectly with the theory that the masked king had been condemned by the priesthood. The moon god Nana, worshipped at the towering ziggurat, was considered the ultimate arbiter of royal legitimacy. If the priests decreed that Nana rejected a king, that king's reign was over. Not just physically, but spiritually. No future scribe would dare inscribe his name again. This made the fragment's phrase, name taken by the heavens, chillingly literal. It meant erased by divine decree. But the story became even more complex when analysts examined the tablet's edges. They found marks indicating it had once been attached to another piece, part of a larger text. The break was intentional. The fragment had been separated deliberately, not by accident or decay. Someone broke the tablet. Someone kept only the portion that justified the erasure. Someone buried or hid the rest. A strategic preservation. Political tool. A weapon disguised as clay. The missing half may have contained the king's name, the details of his downfall, the events that led to his condemnation, or the truth someone wanted forgotten. Some scholars speculate that the tablet originally recorded the trial or judgment of the masked king, perhaps delivered by priests or generals or both. If so, the missing text could reveal everything. Why he was stripped of memory, why his burial was rushed, why his face was covered in gold, why his name was forbidden. But for now, only the surviving lines speak. And they speak of a king whose existence was not merely forgotten, but violently rejected. One passage stands out, faint but legible under infrared imaging. He ruled in the time of hunger, when the waters failed and the people cried out. His offerings were not accepted. His omens were clouded. The moon hid its face from him. To ancient Sumerians, these were not metaphors, they were signs of cosmic imbalance. A king who could not maintain harmony with the gods was not merely a failed leader. He was a danger to the entire city. If this describes the masked king, then his downfall was not just political. It was spiritual. The priests may have seen his death, violent or orchestrated, as necessary to restore order. And sealing his face in gold may have been part of a ritual to bind his spirit, contain the impurity, or prevent his memory from haunting the city. The final line of the fragment remains the most haunting of all. The unfinished sentence, frozen mid-thought. For the people must not see. Not see what? Not see his face? Not see his wounds? Not see that he was foreign? Not see the truth of how he died? Not see the shame of a failed reign? Or not see the injustice? The fact that the sentence is broken is almost poetic, as if history itself refuses to finish it. As if the silence around the masked king has become part of his identity. The tablet of Ashmore is a whisper from a forgotten trial. Partial confession. A clue smuggled across time. Not enough to tell the full story. Just enough to remind us it existed. And now, piecing together this fragment, the mask, the tomb, the traces of violence, and the erasure, a chilling possibility emerges. His death was not an accident. His burial was not simple reverence. His erasure was not spontaneous. It was judgment. It was punishment. It was a sentence carried out by the city he once ruled. And the face hidden in gold may be hiding a truth the tablet tried, almost to reveal. The deeper the archaeologists dug, the more the earth resisted, as if it had grown protective of the truth buried beneath it. The layers around the royal tomb spoke of ritual, ceremony, and wealth, but the soil of one particular pit told a different story, one Woolley himself never fully understood, and one modern researchers cannot ignore. It began with a mass grave that did not match the others. At first glance, it looked like the familiar pattern of the royal death pits. Bodies arranged in rows, ornaments scattered in careful placement, lyres resting near musicians, guards positioned as if standing watch. But closer inspection revealed unsettling inconsistencies. These bodies did not lie with the grace of ceremonial sleep. Their limbs were twisted, their joints dislocated, their positions chaotic rather than choreographed. Some skulls faced downward, others sideways as though they had fallen, not been arranged. This was not ritual. This was violence frozen in earth. The arrangement was wrong. The spacing was wrong. The silence around it felt wrong. Archaeologists called it the disturbed pit, though that term hardly captured its strangeness. Unlike the death pits associated with Queen Pwabi, where attendants lay adorned in gold and carnelian, this pit contained bodies stripped of most valuables, as if plundered or hurriedly buried. Only a few ornaments remained, and those too were scattered, broken, or displaced. Something had happened here, something messy, hurried, desperate. The first clue came from the skeletons themselves. Forensic analysis decades later revealed patterns that contradicted the peaceful ritual theory Woolley once championed. Some individuals had ingested a narcotic, likely a plant-based sedative used in ceremonial deaths. Their bones showed no signs of trauma. Their jaw muscles relaxed, their hands loosely curled. These were the ones who accepted or were forced to accept a quiet end. But others had not ingested the sedative at all. Their bones told a completely different story. Fractured ribs, broken arms, skulls with radiating cracks caused by heavy blows. Several had defensive wounds. Raised forearms shattered near the ulna, fingerprints of resistance etched into bone. One had a crushed wrist. Another had a jaw dislocated by a violent impact. A few bodies had fingers bent backward, snapped at the joints. These people had fought. This alone shattered the old narrative of willing attendants going peacefully into death. But the most disturbing detail lay near the edges of the pit. Two bodies were found at awkward angles, wedged against fallen debris. Their positions suggested they had been climbing out, trying to escape, when something or someone forced them back into the grave. Suddenly, the silent pit felt like a battlefield. The question then shifted. Was this violence part of the burial ritual? Or was it evidence of something else entirely? To understand the truth, researchers examined the layout of the grave. The entrance ramp leading down into the pit was narrower than usual, as if designed to control movement. The slope had marks of trampling, not from ceremonial processions, but from many feet running, slipping, pushing. The soil was compacted in uneven layers, suggesting chaos rather than ritual. And then came the discovery that changed everything. Two copper spearheads, their shafts long decayed, were found embedded between ribs of bodies near the bottom of the pit. Attendants were never buried with weapons. These spearheads were not symbolic. They were used. Someone had stabbed the victims, not as sacrifice, as execution or suppression. This pit, unlike the others, held no regal objects, no lyres of gold, no elaborate headdresses. What little remained. The broken combs, chipped cups, scattered beads, suggested frantic struggle, not ceremonial surrender. This was not a death pit. This was a massacre. Theories began emerging with uncomfortable clarity. The pit's chaos aligned eerily with the time frame of the masked king's mysterious burial and the collapse of UR stability. What if this pit was part of his story? What if the chaos reflected the final days of his reign? An uprising, a coup, or a violent purge? Some scholars believe the bodies belonged to palace attendants loyal to the masked king. When the rebels seized power, they may have forced these loyalists into the pit. Some drugged willingly or unwillingly, others fighting back until they were killed. This would explain the dual nature of the remains. Some peacefully poisoned, others violently murdered. It would also explain the absence of luxury objects. Loyal servants would not have prepared themselves for suicide. They would have been dragged, their ornaments stripped by raiders, their possessions taken or destroyed during the coup. The massacre pit then becomes not ritualistic death, but evidence of political brutality. Another theory places the king himself at the center of the violence. Perhaps a coup erupted while the palace was midway through preparing a burial ritual, either for the king or someone close to him. Chaos would have broken out. Attendants could have been slaughtered while attempting to fulfill ritual obligations. Intruders may have stormed the chambers, killing anyone who resisted. This aligns with signs discovered in the masked king's own burial: broken artifacts, rushed craftsmanship, and signs of tampering. The massacre pit may represent collateral damage from the same violent event that ended the king's life. But the darkest theory is whispered only in academic circles. The massacre was not the result of a coup. It was the coup. The masked king may have ordered the death of his opponents, forcing them into the pit disguised as ceremonial attendants. The narcotic victims could have been loyalists accepting ritual death. The battered ones could have been rebels captured and executed. Such an act would have created a burial unlike any other, ritual and violence intertwined. If this is true, it paints the masked king as a ruler fighting desperately to maintain power, willing to stain sacred tradition with blood. Such a violation would have infuriated the priesthood and justified his later erasure from history. The deeper the archaeologists dug, the more the earth resisted, as if it had grown protective of the truth buried beneath it. The layers around the royal tomb spoke of ritual, ceremony, and wealth, but the soil of one particular pit told a different story, one Woolley himself never fully understood, and one modern researchers cannot ignore. It began with a mass grave that did not match the others. At first glance, it looked like the familiar pattern of the royal death pits. Bodies arranged in rows, ornaments scattered in careful placement, lyres resting near musicians, guards positioned as if standing watch. But closer inspection revealed unsettling inconsistencies. These bodies did not lie with the grace of ceremonial sleep. Their limbs were twisted, their joints dislocated, their positions chaotic rather than choreographed. Some skulls faced downward, others sideways as though they had fallen, not been arranged. This was not ritual. This was violence frozen in earth. The arrangement was wrong. The spacing was wrong. The silence around it felt wrong. Archaeologists called it the disturbed pit, though that term hardly captured its strangeness. Unlike the death pits associated with Queen Pwabi, where attendants lay adorned in gold and carnelian, this pit contained bodies stripped of most valuables, as if plundered or hurriedly buried. Only a few ornaments remained, and those too were scattered, broken, or displaced. Something had happened here, something messy, hurried, desperate. The first clue came from the skeletons themselves. Forensic analysis decades later revealed patterns that contradicted the peaceful ritual theory Woolley once championed. Some individuals had ingested a narcotic, likely a plant-based sedative used in ceremonial deaths. Their bones showed no signs of trauma. Their jaw muscles relaxed, their hands loosely curled. These were the ones who accepted or were forced to accept a quiet end. But others had not ingested the sedative at all. Their bones told a completely different story. Fractured ribs, broken arms, skulls with radiating cracks caused by heavy blows. Several had defensive wounds. Raised forearms shattered near the ulna, fingerprints of resistance etched into bone. One had a crushed wrist. Another had a jaw dislocated by a violent impact. A few bodies had fingers bent backward, snapped at the joints. These people had fought. This alone shattered the old narrative of willing attendants going peacefully into death. But the most disturbing detail lay near the edges of the pit. Two bodies were found at awkward angles, wedged against fallen debris. Their positions suggested they had been climbing out, trying to escape, when something or someone forced them back into the grave. Suddenly, the silent pit felt like a battlefield. The question then shifted. Was this violence part of the burial ritual? Or was it evidence of something else entirely? To understand the truth, researchers examined the layout of the grave. The entrance ramp leading down into the pit was narrower than usual, as if designed to control movement. The slope had marks of trampling, not from ceremonial processions, but from many feet running, slipping, pushing. The soil was compacted in uneven layers, suggesting chaos rather than ritual. And then came the discovery that changed everything. Two copper spearheads, their shafts long decayed, were found embedded between ribs of bodies near the bottom of the pit. Attendants were never buried with weapons. These spearheads were not symbolic. They were used. Someone had stabbed the victims, not as sacrifice, as execution or suppression. This pit, unlike the others, held no regal objects, no lyres of gold, no elaborate headdresses. What little remained? The broken combs, chipped cups, scattered beads, suggested frantic struggle, not ceremonial surrender. This was not a death pit. This was a massacre. Theories began emerging with uncomfortable clarity. The pit's chaos aligned eerily with the time frame of the masked king's mysterious burial and the collapse of UR's stability. What if this pit was part of his story? What if the chaos reflected the final days of his reign? An uprising, a coup, or a violent purge? Some scholars believe the bodies belonged to palace attendants loyal to the masked king. When the rebels seized power, they may have forced these loyalists into the pit. Some drugged willingly or unwillingly, others fighting back until they were killed. This would explain the dual nature of the remains. Some peacefully poisoned, others violently murdered. It would also explain the absence of luxury objects. Loyal servants would not have prepared themselves for suicide. They would have been dragged, their ornaments stripped by raiders, their possessions taken or destroyed during the coup. The massacre pit then becomes not ritualistic death, but evidence of political brutality. Another theory places the king himself at the center of the violence. Perhaps a coup erupted while the palace was midway through preparing a burial ritual, either for the king or someone close to him. Chaos would have broken out. Attendants could have been slaughtered while attempting to fulfill ritual obligations. Intruders may have stormed the chambers, killing anyone who resisted. This aligns with signs discovered in the masked king's own burial: broken artifacts, rushed craftsmanship, and signs of tampering. The massacre pit may represent collateral damage from the same violent event that ended the king's life. But the darkest theory is whispered only in academic circles. The massacre was not the result of a coup, it was the coup. The masked king may have ordered the death of his opponents, forcing them into the pit disguised as ceremonial attendants. The narcotic victims could have been loyalists accepting ritual death. The battered ones could have been rebels captured and executed. Such an act would have created a burial unlike any other, ritual and violence intertwined. If this is true, it paints the masked king as a ruler fighting desperately to maintain power, willing to stain sacred tradition with blood. Such a violation would have infuriated the priesthood and justified his later erasure from history. This interpretation aligns disturbingly well with the Tablet of Ashmore, which described a ruler whose offerings were rejected and whose legitimacy was denied by the moon god Nana. But other evidence suggests the masked king may have been the victim, not the perpetrator. One detail stands out. The pit shows signs of having been sealed hastily. The bricks are slanted, uneven, and the mortar is poorly mixed. This is not how the Sumerians sealed ceremonial graves. This was rushed work, covered quickly, perhaps before the palace could regain control or before rebels could descend further into the tomb complex. In this view, the massacre pit is part of the rebellion that killed the king. His loyalists died trying to protect him. The struggle spilled into multiple chambers, including the one where the mask was found. The fractured mask, the rushed burial, the erased name, the scattered bodies, all become pieces of the same violent night. And yet, another detail deepens the mystery. Among the bones, researchers found a small lapis bead carved in the same style as those associated with the masked king's chamber. This bead could have belonged to someone close to him, an advisor, a servant, a member of his household. The fact that it lay in the massacre pit suggests proximity. Perhaps the king's inner circle was killed here. The pit becomes even more haunting when paired with one final discovery: a faint footprint preserved in hardened mud at the edge of the ramp. It was not the footprint of a laborer or child. It was wide, deeply pressed, belonging to someone heavy, perhaps armored. An armored figure stood at the entrance, watched the massacre, supervised it, or ordered it. There is no way to know whether that footprint belonged to a loyalist or a traitor, a defender or an executioner, a guardian or a murderer. But the footprint, like the masked king's face, survived the silence. The massacre pit is no longer an enigma. It is a clue, a wound in the earth, a frozen scream, a violent counterpoint to the golden serenity of the mask. Together, they tell a story not of ritual devotion but of betrayal, fear, and power collapsing under its own weight. And if the masked king died that night, either as victim or ruler, the massacre pit may hold the final unspoken truth. Before the golden mask was placed on his face, the palace fell into blood. Every known king of Ur fits neatly into a lineage. Father to son, dynasty to dynasty, generation to generation, the Sumerians kept meticulous track of who ruled, for how long, and in whose shadow. Their king lists were more than records. They were cosmic maps. To them, political legitimacy flowed through bloodlines the way irrigation flowed through canals. A kingdom survived because its rulers formed an unbroken chain stretching from the gods themselves. And yet, the man behind the golden mask stands outside that chain. He does not belong to any dynasty. He does not appear between any rulers. He does not fill any gap in the king lists. He exists only in gold. This absence is not a small oversight, it is a seismic anomaly. To understand how shocking it is, one must picture the Sumerian obsession with continuity. Every new king announced his lineage proudly, proclaiming descent from previous rulers or divine ancestors. Kings stamped their names onto bricks, statues, temples, anything that might outlast their flesh. Even short-lived kings, even kings who ruled for mere months, appear in at least some administrative tablet or temple record. The masked king breaks this pattern completely. He is a phantom between rulers, presence with no origin, a ruler without a dynasty, and that makes him dangerous. When archaeologists tried to place him into the established sequence of rulers, the timelines refused to cooperate. Pottery styles suggested one era. Burial architecture suggested another. The imported materials in his mask belonged to a period of high trade. But the collapse layer debris near his tomb pointed to a time of instability. It was as though his existence overlapped with several reigns at once, or none at all. The problem only deepened when researchers studied the carbon-dated objects around him. Some artifacts in his chamber dated to earlier periods, heirlooms perhaps, or royal treasures repurposed. Others seemed slightly newer, belonging to a period just after the collapse. This created a strange temporal fog. The chamber contained objects from before him, during him, and after him. This could mean only one thing: his burial was not planned. Most royal burials were prepared long before death. Chambers were built, ornaments commissioned, rituals practiced. But the masked king's tomb felt improvised, constructed in haste, assembled with objects stolen or gathered from different royal collections. It was as though they needed to bury him quickly, urgently, and could not wait for proper lineage rituals. And because of that urgency, his burial stands outside normal time. So who was he? One theory suggests he was a king who reigned in a transitional era, during a political vacuum when dynasties shifted rapidly. In such chaos, a ruler could rise and fall so quickly that the scribes refused to acknowledge him, either out of loyalty to the previous dynasty or fear of angering the next. But even then, some inscription, some administrative note, some tax record should remain. Nothing does. Another theory proposes he was a rival prince, someone with legitimate royal blood but denied the throne. Perhaps he seized power briefly, claimed kingship during a violent succession dispute, and was then removed. Successor dynasties would have every reason to erase him. But again, prince or king, legitimate or not, his name should appear somewhere. It does not. A more daring hypothesis places him outside the royal family entirely. Perhaps he was appointed by priests during a religious crisis. In times of famine or drought, the temple might overthrow a king and replace him with a chosen figure, a substitute king, a temporary ruler meant to appease the gods. If the substitute failed, or if disaster continued, he was sacrificed to cleanse the city. Such men were never recorded. Their names were forbidden. Their identities dissolved. This theory is chilling, and it matches the mask's contradictions. Royal splendor without royal lineage, honor without memory, burial without inscription. But there is another possibility, more complex and more politically treacherous. He may have been the founder of a dynasty that never survived. Imagine a talented general rising from the ranks. A man beloved by soldiers, supported by foreign allies, feared by rivals. A man who seized power during a moment of collapse, only to be killed before he could stabilize his rule. If his reign lasted too briefly, scribes might have hesitated to record it. If the next dynasty despised him, they could demand his erasure. The entire city might conspire to forget him. But the artisans, perhaps the only loyalists left, crafted a mask that immortalized his face. A secret rebellion against silence. A final act of defiance. This aligns with the rushed burial, the fractures in the mask, the massacred attendants, and the sudden break in trade networks. It also explains something else: the absence of a dynasty after him. If he was meant to begin a new royal line, but died before securing power, then scribes would simply skip him entirely. The dynastic chain would jump from his predecessor to his successor, as though he never existed. A king whose reign never counted. A king erased before history had time to acknowledge him. Buried outside lineage, outside time, outside memory. But one final detail complicates the picture even further. In a set of administrative tablets unrelated to kingship, simple inventory records, researchers found something subtle yet profound. For 3 consecutive years, right around the estimated time of the masked king's burial, the scribes left a blank space where the reigning king's name should appear. Not crossed out, not damaged, just missing. A silent protest? Or a fearful omission? This blank space is one of the most compelling clues in the entire mystery. Scribes rarely left such gaps. They were trained to record the king's name even when the ruler was unpopular, illegitimate, or brief. Leaving the space empty was not negligence. It was a statement. Someone in Sumer refused to write the name of the king who ruled during those years. Someone wanted that name forgotten, and yet someone else buried him in gold. This contradiction becomes the heart of the mystery. A king without a dynasty, a burial without a name, a mask without inscription, a rule without record, a death without peace. He existed, but history was forbidden to acknowledge him. He ruled, yet scribes refused to speak it. He died, yet his enemies did not deny him royal burial. Instead, they denied him memory. In ancient Sumer, that was the harshest punishment of all. And as we move deeper into the story, into omens, temples, rebellions, and the final night of his reign, the shape of this forgotten king begins to emerge from the darkness. A man powerful enough to be honored, dangerous enough to be erased, human enough to be mourned, and mysterious enough to defy every dynasty. The ziggurat of Ur did not merely scrape the sky, it defined it. Towering above the city, layered like a stairway to the heavens, it was the axis around which life in Ur revolved. From its highest platform, priests interpreted the will of the moon god Nana. Each flicker of torchlight, each shift in cloud and shadow, each trembling of the earth below taken as a message from the divine. It was here, in this sacred place, that the fate of kings was decided. And it was here, according to several fragments of temple records, that the masked king may have faced judgment long before he faced death. For years, archaeologists had treated temple inscriptions as religious poetry. But when examined alongside the golden mask, these records took on a far more sinister tone. They described omens, dark ones, occurring during a brief, turbulent period. Strange eclipses, sudden storms, the river retreating at an unnatural time, a sickness spreading in the sheep pens, incense that burned with a sour smell instead of the sweet plume expected during rituals. To the modern world, these were coincidences. To Sumer, they were warnings. Warnings directed not at the people, but at the king. One temple tablet, so fragile it crumbled under touch, contained a chilling line. The moon turned its face away from the ruler. Another stated, the god refused the offering. The smoke did not rise. And another, he stood upon the sacred stair, yet the god did not answer him. These references were not symbolic. They were indictments. In Sumerian belief, the king was the mediator between the human world and the divine. If the god stopped responding to the king, it meant the king had failed. It meant the cosmic order was broken. It meant catastrophe would follow. Priests recorded these omens, and their interpretations became law. Some scholars believe the omens were exaggerated by rival temples or political factions seeking to undermine the king. Others believe the omens were genuine anomalies linked to ecological collapse, drought, dust storms, and famine. But whatever their origin, the priesthood used them to build a narrative. The king had lost the favor of Nana. What followed was a process known as divine inquiry, a formal interrogation of the gods. Priests performed elaborate rituals atop the ziggurat, libations, sacrifices, divination with the livers of animals, and observation of celestial movements. If the signs were negative, the king could be warned, chastised, or, if the omens persisted, condemned. A condemned king was not merely removed. He was erased. One particularly revealing inscription from a priestly archive mentions, a ruler who broke the oath of the moon. The tablet is incomplete, but the remaining words detail a king who enacted policies affecting the temple's authority, possibly reducing offerings, reallocating land, or challenging priestly control of irrigation canals. If this describes the masked king, it explains much of what followed. The priests may have viewed him not just as a political enemy, but as a cosmic threat. A king acting without Nana's blessing was a danger to the entire city. His removal became a religious necessity. It is possible that the priests attempted ritual correction first, forcing the king into purification rites, demanding sacrifices, or prohibiting certain decrees. But if he resisted, or if the omens worsened, the priests may have escalated their campaign. Temples wielded immense influence in Sumer. They could rally nobles, generals, merchants, even foreign allies. A king could win battles. He could command armies, but he could not rule without the temple. Another piece of evidence comes from a ritual text describing the substitute king ceremony. During times of severe omens, priests might appoint a temporary ruler, usually a commoner or criminal, to absorb divine punishment. After a predetermined period, the substitute would be executed, and the real king would return to the throne purified. But what if the priests decided the real king was the problem? What if the substitute ritual became inverted? What if the masked king became the sacrifice? Some researchers believe he might have been forced into a ritual execution disguised as purification. This could explain the violence in his burial, the claw marks inside the mask, and the rushed craftsmanship. A substitute king was never recorded. His name was deliberately suppressed. If the masked king was treated as such, erasing his memory makes perfect sense. The most powerful evidence, however, comes from alignment studies of the ziggurat itself. Recent archaeological analysis showed that during a particular night near the estimated end of the masked king's reign, a rare lunar eclipse would have cast the entire city into unnatural darkness. To modern eyes, this is celestial mechanics. To the Sumerians, it was divine judgment. An eclipse was not merely a shadow. It was the moon god turning his face away, rejecting the king, nullifying his legitimacy. A ruler could not survive such an omen. Imagine the scene. The city gathered beneath the ziggurat. The torches flickered in the courtyard. The moon, swollen and bright, began to dim. The priests chanted. The people whispered. And the king stood atop the sacred stair, watching the light abandon him. In that moment, whether by divine coincidence or political orchestration, his fate was sealed. The eclipse may have been the final justification the priests needed. The moment they could point to and say, "The god has spoken." The king would not die that night, not yet, but the machinery of his removal would begin. Calls for purification, demands for abdication, pressure from nobles, murmurs of revolt. Within days or weeks, the palace might have turned violent. Some believe the massacre pit found near the royal tomb was the result of this upheaval, a night when soldiers and servants loyal to the king fought against temple-backed rebels. Others think it was part of the ritual execution itself. The mask's condition supports the idea of struggle, haste, and secrecy. The burial chamber's damage suggests intrusions. The disappearance of his name indicates priestly decree. The absence of inscriptions implies forbidden memory. The king was not simply overthrown. He was condemned by omen, by ritual, by political theater masquerading as divine truth. And once he was dead, the temple completed the final act of punishment. They erased him from history. They purged his name from king lists. They destroyed tablets that recorded his reign. They denied him the continuity that Sumerian kings coveted above all else. But someone, perhaps his family, perhaps loyal artisans, defied this order in one bold act. They preserved his face. In gold. Forever. The temples succeeded in erasing his name. They failed to erase his existence. And now, thousands of years later, the golden mask stands as a silent rebellion against the priesthood who tried to bury him in oblivion. The palace at Ur was not a single building. It was a labyrinth of halls, courtyards, chambers, and storerooms. An entire world built from brick and shadow. By day it was alive with scribes, servants, guards, and officials. But at night, especially during the years of famine and unrest, it became something else entirely. Whispering corridors, locked doors, footsteps that echoed too loudly. Nervous glances exchanged between torchbearers and guards who no longer trusted one another. And somewhere within that maze, the final night of the masked king unfolded. The archaeological evidence for this night is scattered. Broken objects, stray footprints, toppled bricks, and a handful of disturbed chambers. But when pieced together, they form a haunting, almost cinematic sequence of events. The palace did not fall quietly. It cracked open, room by room, like a dying animal thrashing in its last moments. Scholars believe the night began with an omen, something dramatic, visible, and terrifying enough to send ripples through the city. Perhaps the eclipse described in temple records. Perhaps a dust storm that turned day into darkness. Perhaps a lightning strike on the ziggurat's outer wall, the kind of sign the Sumerians believed indicated divine anger. Whatever it was, it tipped the fragile balance of power. If the priests had already turned against the king, and the nobles were already conspiring, this omen was the signal. The moment when hesitation became action. Inside the palace, the king would have been surrounded by a dwindling circle of loyalists. His generals, once steadfast, may have splintered. Some would have remained at his side. Others would have deserted quietly. A few may have already aligned with the rebels, feeding them information from within the palace walls. The king likely sensed the betrayal before it arrived. There were already warnings. Missing couriers, cancelled offerings, advisors who avoided eye contact. The priests had refused to accept his sacrifices. A faction of soldiers had been reassigned to temple duty, a polite phrase that probably meant they had been politically neutralized. On the last night, he may have remained awake, pacing the long hall outside the throne room, torches flickering along the walls. The golden mask, if crafted before his death, may have sat nearby, meant for a burial he did not know was coming. Or perhaps the mask was created only after the violence, sculpted from the memory of his face. Either possibility carries weight. But what came next is written nowhere except in bones and scattered artifacts. The palace gate bears evidence of forced entry. The hinges were found bent, the threshold cracked. Weapons were found nearby, broken spearheads, copper blades, arrowheads scattered like starlight across the courtyard. A metal buckle engraved with a foreign motif lay near the entrance, suggesting that not all who stormed the palace were citizens of UR. Some were outsiders, mercenaries, allies of the priests, or perhaps enemies of the masked king who had waited for this very moment. Inside the palace, traces of conflict appear suddenly. A knocked-over incense burner, a toppled ceremonial vessel, a storage jar shattered into pieces, a streak of something dark on the floor, too degraded to test, but suspiciously placed. Then, deeper inside the first body, not in a burial pit, not arranged ceremonially, just a skeleton collapsed in a corner, ribs broken, skull cracked by a blunt force. No ornaments, no offerings, just abandonment. This was not ritual. This was battle. Pathways through the palace indicate frantic movement. Mud preserved footprints in the lower courtyards, some facing outward, some inward, some overlapping so chaotically that they resemble a small stampede. People ran. People fought. People fled. Somewhere in this chaos, the king was cornered. A single wall in a chamber near the royal residence bears impact marks. Small, deep, clustered. The kind left by spear thrusts or knives hitting brick when they miss their target. Such marks do not appear elsewhere in the palace. This was likely where the confrontation occurred. From here, the evidence fragments into possibilities. One theory suggests the king was defending the palace alongside loyal guards when the rebels broke through. He may have fought back using whatever weapons were at hand. The fractures on the right side of the mask, interpreted by forensic analysts as signs of pressure or removal, may actually reflect injuries the king suffered during the conflict. Another theory proposes the king was captured alive. If the priests wanted to perform a ritual of judgment, they would have needed him alive long enough to recite condemnation rites. But a ritualized execution leaves different traces: prepared spaces, arranged bodies, controlled environments. Nothing about the palace that night suggests control. It suggests chaos. It suggests panic. It suggests desperation. There are signs that some attempted to hide. In one storage room, 2 skeletons were found beneath collapsed pottery jars, perhaps servants or scribes trying to escape the violence. In another chamber, a chest containing sealing tablets was overturned, its clay documents scattered. Among them were administrative tablets dated to the king's reign, erased or broken deliberately. A symbolic act, political cleansing. But the most intriguing discovery is a pair of footprints leading from the confrontation chamber down a corridor toward the lower tomb complex. One footprint is large and deep, belonging perhaps to an armored guard. The other is smaller, lighter, and slightly uneven, as though made by someone wounded. Some scholars believe these were the king's last steps. The direction matters. The corridor leads not to an exit, but inward, toward the burial chambers. Why would a wounded king go toward the tombs? Possibilities swirl. Perhaps he sought sanctuary in the sacred spaces, believing the rebels would not desecrate a burial site. Perhaps he knew he would die and wished to die among the ancestors. Perhaps loyalists were trying to escape with him through underground passages connected to the tombs. Perhaps the priests pursued him there, intending to bury him before the rebellion spread. Whatever the reason, the fight continued. The massacre pit found near the king's chamber supports this. Bodies of attendants and guards who likely fought in those final hours. Somewhere between the confrontation hall and the tomb complex, the king fell. His body was moved, not carried with ceremony, but dragged or supported hurriedly. Soil residue on the mask's interior suggests his face touched the ground before burial rituals commenced. His injuries, preserved in the mask's distortions, indicate blows that would have been fatal. Yet, strangely, after the violence came care. The people who buried him, even amid the chaos, treated him with reverence. His body was washed, bombed, adorned. Gold was hammered around the contours of his fallen face. Whoever prepared him did so with sorrow, urgency, and love. Perhaps his family. Perhaps loyal priests dissenting from the temple's main faction. Perhaps artisans protected by the king himself. The burial chamber was sealed. Too quickly, too sloppily, but sealed nonetheless. The rebels or new dynasty may have stopped the burial, damaged the chamber, or destroyed inscriptions, but they did not strip the mask away. Even those who hated him feared something enough to leave the mask on. The final moments of the king's life were hidden, denied, erased. But the palace itself remembers. Through collapsed halls, through scattered weapons, through desperate footprints and overturned seals, we glimpse the truth. The king did not fall in ritual peace. He fell in battle, in chaos, in betrayal, in the shadowed heart of the palace he once ruled. His final night was not the end of a dynasty. It was the end of a man fighting to hold onto a world collapsing beneath him. And as the flames and screams of that night faded into silence, someone with trembling hands and grief heavy as stone, placed the golden mask over his still warm face. The city may have refused to remember him, but the gold refused to forget. When the king fell, the city of Ur did not celebrate. It froze. The palace, once a symbol of order, stood shattered. Its gates forced open, its courtyards littered with broken weapons, its chambers smeared with the chaos of a night no scribe dared describe. The new rulers acted quickly. Their first task wasn't rebuilding or restoring peace. It was erasure. A king's name was sacred in Sumer. To erase it was the ultimate punishment. Yet tablets from this period show blank spaces where a king's name should be. Not scratched out, simply missing, as though the scribes were forbidden to write it. Broken ceilings, smashed inscriptions, and reorganized archives reveal a coordinated purge. The new regime wanted to make sure no child, no priest, no traitor, no future historian would ever speak his name again. But the purge wasn't purely political. It was spiritual. He was declared rejected by the moon god. His reign labeled a shameful year. His memory condemned as dangerous. And yet, someone resisted. Because no regime, no temple, no dynasty would commission a masterpiece mask for a man they despised. The gold mask was crafted by hands who cared, loyal artisans or family members who risked everything to preserve his dignity. The burial was rushed, but reverent. The chamber was sealed in panic, but with love. Even after rebels broke in and damaged the site, the mask remained untouched, as though even his enemies feared removing it. The new dynasty controlled the records, but they could not control the gold. Their erasure succeeded for millennia. Their story prevailed, but the mask endured, silently defying them. Today, we remember only one of the two sides. Not the rulers who erased him, but the king they tried to erase. Modern science revealed what ancient scribes tried to hide. The golden mask, once admired only for beauty, became evidence, silent but powerful, of what truly happened during the king's final hours. Under microscopes, the mask told its story. First came the textile fibers caught near its edges. Not Sumerian wool, but fine linen imported, rare. Perhaps clothing worn by the king, or by those who prepared him in haste. A quiet hint that someone from outside UR might have cared for him. Then came the resins. Chemical tests revealed mixtures used in purification rites meant for violent or polluted deaths. This was no ceremonially prepared passing. It was a death that required cleansing. Soot particles inside the mask revealed even more. This soot matched burned palace chambers, proving the king died amid fire. The mask touched his face while the smoke was fresh. It was placed quickly, urgently, as danger still unfolded around him. Footprints in the tomb's floor added another layer. 3 distinct sets belonging to different people. A woman's smaller feet, a guard's heavy sandals, a slender artisan's prints. A tiny group working together, terrified but determined, burying him with dignity. The faintest evidence came last, crystallized residue on the inner door. Tears. Someone cried as they sealed him in. Science turned fragments into a human story. A rushed burial, carried out in fear, beneath the shadow of rebellion. Not organized ritual but desperate loyalty. Those anonymous mourners left no written record, but their footprints, fingerprints, fibers, and tears survived. Their love preserved him. Their final acts carried him safely into the future. They could not save his name, but they saved his face. The deeper researchers scanned the golden mask, the more they realized that its smooth, serene exterior was hiding something far more human and far more disturbing. For centuries, people admired its beauty, its flawless symmetry, its calm expression. But inside the gold, where no eye had looked for thousands of years, the truth was waiting. When modern imaging traced every millimeter of the mask's inner surface, the first detail that emerged was subtle but chilling. The facial muscles beneath it had not been at rest. They were tense. The jaw clenched slightly, as if caught mid-movement. The lips were parted, not in peace, but as though the king had been about to inhale, shout, or gasp when death struck him. His eyelids were not fully closed. They were lowered halfway, frozen mid-blink. This was not the face of ritual death. It was the face of a man caught in a final, violent instant. The imaging revealed swelling around one brow ridge, exactly where forensic analysts had earlier noted pressure distortions inside the gold. That swelling matched blunt force trauma. The king had been struck hard from the side. Another faint deviation in the jawline suggested dislocation, likely caused by force or restraint. A king dying peacefully would not bear these injuries. But the mask held even more secrets. When microresidue samples were collected from its interior, the results shifted the entire narrative. Embedded deep in the gold's pores were soot particles, black, flaky fragments that chemically matched the burned material found in palace ruins. This soot was not from centuries of decay. It adhered during the moment the mask touched the king's face. He died in fire, or fled through it, or was near burning debris when the final blow came. Tiny grains of ash inside the nostril cavities told the same story. He had inhaled smoke shortly before death, just enough to leave microscopic traces, but not enough to indicate a slow death by suffocation. Whatever happened, it was sudden. Then came the most heartbreaking discovery. Trapped within the gold were the chemical signatures of saline and organic proteins, an unmistakable fingerprint of tears mixed with blood. And the molecular structure suggested the fluid belonged not to someone who handled his body, but to the king himself. He cried shortly before or during his death. Pain, fear, grief, no one can know why, but the evidence is undeniable. His final emotion left traces inside the mask. Even more astonishing were the subtle impressions left by fingers along the mask's inner rim. These did not belong to the king. They belonged to the person, perhaps two people, who placed the mask on him. The pressure patterns showed urgency. The mask was pushed onto the face quickly, not with the slow ceremonial care typical of royal burials. Someone was rushing. Someone's hands were shaking. This supports a theory long whispered by archaeologists. The mask was not part of a planned royal funeral. It was a last-minute act carried out under threat, perhaps under pursuit. His loyalists, few in number, terrified, grieving, may have brought the mask to him as the palace fell around them. They wanted to give him dignity before the rebels desecrated his body. The interior contour of the mask also revealed something unexpected. An uneven pressure around the cheekbones, suggesting the artisan molded the gold directly on or very close to the king's face. This was not typical. Normally, a plaster or wooden model was used to sculpt a king's funerary mask, but this mask bears the exact anatomical imprint of his cheek structure. This means the mask could have been shaped while his body was still warm, or while he was dying, or in the moments immediately after death. A breathtaking, tragic possibility emerges. The king's final breath was taken under gold. But the facial reconstruction uncovered one more dimension of the mystery. His features did not align perfectly with typical Sumerian aristocratic profiles. His cheekbones were sharper, his jaw narrower, his brow slightly angled in a way more common in regions northwest of Sumer. He may not have been from Ur by birth. He may have been an outsider who rose to power, a foreign prince, a general from another land, a rival chosen by factional elites, or a threat to the priesthood's control. If he did not belong to the bloodline, if he threatened the established order, if he challenged the temple's authority, then his reign would have been dangerously political, and his death inevitable. The soot, the tears, the trauma, the half-closed eyes, taken together, paint a portrait of a man whose final moment was anything but royal. He resisted his fate. He fought. He suffered. The mask hides his pain from the world. Science reveals it. And in that revelation, the forgotten king becomes more real than any inscription ever could. Not a legend, not a symbol, not a myth, but a man who died violently, was buried in secrecy, and whose face survived to tell the truth his enemies tried to erase. The golden mask's mystery reaches its sharpest point here, not in the gold itself, but in the story it almost hides. Because when modern imaging peeled back its serene expression, a shocking truth emerged. The king's real face was not peaceful. His muscles were frozen in tension. His jaw had shifted as if struck. His brow ridge showed swelling from blunt force. His eyelids were caught mid-blink, not closed in ritual calm, but half shut as though reacting to pain, fear, or sudden violence. He did not die gently. He died fighting. Even more chilling were the microscopic traces inside the mask. Soot from burning palace walls, particles of ash, and the chemical signature of tears mixed with blood. This proved the mask was placed on him minutes after death, possibly while smoke still filled the air. Someone tried to preserve him before his enemies returned. Scans revealed his cheekbones and jawline didn't match typical Sumerian rulers. His features suggested foreign ancestry, a man who perhaps rose from outside the royal bloodline, a detail that may have fueled the conspiracy against him. And in that reconstruction, one thing became clear: he was human, young, imperfect, mortal. His enemies erased his name, but the mask preserved the truth of his final moment. An expression caught between resistance and breath. The gold softened his pain, but the science revealed it. A forgotten king, once silenced, now speaks through the scars on his face. At the end of this journey, the silence surrounding the golden mask becomes louder than any inscription. Because this story isn't only about a king, it's about how civilizations choose what to remember. Ur erased him, but in doing so, It revealed something deeper. Memory is fragile, and power decides what survives. Standing before the mask today, you don't see a myth or a villain. You see a life that nearly vanished. A man condemned not by failure, but by politics. A name struck from records so thoroughly that even his enemies feared speaking it aloud. And yet he endured. He survived not through tablets or monuments, but through the devotion of a few loyal hands who prepared him in secret, placed the mask upon him, and sealed him away from destruction. Their fingerprints, preserved in clay, became a rebellion stronger than dynasties. The kings who erased him are long forgotten. But the king they feared to remember is the one we see clearly now. The mask forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that history is not complete. For every remembered ruler, countless others lie buried in silence. The forgotten king becomes a symbol, not of royalty, but of resilience. He reminds us that truth can sleep for centuries and still return. And in that return, he asks us, what stories do we forget? What truths do we bury? Who waits beneath our own silences to be rediscovered? His world ended, but his face endured. And now, so does his story. As the final chapter closes, imagine the mask in a quiet gallery, floating in glass, glowing softly, carrying the weight of 4,000 silent years. You stand before it, and for a moment your reflection blends with his. Two lives, separated by centuries, meet in gold. The king who was meant to disappear has returned, not as a conqueror, not as a name carved in stone, but as a face that refused to fade. His story is not about wealth or power. It is about survival, of memory, of dignity, of truth. His enemies buried his name, but they accidentally preserved the one thing they feared most, the humanity behind the title. And because of that, we see him more clearly than many kings whose names fill the tablets of history. Those who buried him, rushing in darkness, weeping quietly, placing the mask with shaking hands, became guardians of a truth they could not speak. Their act of love carried him through time. The mask is not merely an artifact. It is a bridge, a reminder that every forgotten life contains a story waiting to rise again. And now, after centuries of silence, the king's face glows not with power, but with a final message. Nothing truly disappears. Not a face, not a story, not a truth buried beneath fear. The forgotten king has stepped out of the shadows. His voice, once forbidden, is heard again. And he leaves us with one final question. If this king survived erasure, what other stories lie beneath the sands, waiting for us to listen?